23. Welcome to the unceded territories of the Squamish Nation. I am Lauren Greenlaw, Councillor Lauren Greenlaw, acting as mayor, chairing this meeting. Can I get an adoption of the agenda? Well, but we didn't do it in this one, though. We haven't done it in the open yet. We did do it? Okay. Well, then we'll move to our first order of business, which is visitor and camping management update from staff.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. My name is Megan Latimer. I'm the General Manager of Public Safety with the district. My pronouns are she and hers, and you may address me accordingly. This morning, we are here to discuss the 2022 Visitor Management End of Season Report. The purpose of this presentation is to provide Council with updates, including benchmarking data and recommendations regarding education enforcement activities related to visitor and camping management in 2022, and to seek direction regarding the future use of the municipal campground. So for some background, Squamish has seen an increase in visitors every summer over recent years, with a significant surge during the COVID-19 pandemic years. In 2021 and 2022, the district began collecting data on visitor impacts, including bylaw complaints and issues found by community patrol officers, RCMP calls for service, fire department responses to campfires, low availability on the campsite availability calendar, reports from Tourism Squamish's destination stewards, and from vehicle counts on Forest Service roads used to access recreational destinations. While most visitors are respectful, some behavior, as well as the growing volume of visitors, leads to environmental impacts. For example, human waste, garbage, destruction of sensitive wildlife habitat, and emergency concerns, including search and rescue needs and wildfire risk. Communication, education, and enforcement are widely regarded as necessary tools to help mitigate the growing impacts of high seasonal visitation in the community. To help manage visitor impacts during the summer season, in 2021, district staff developed the Visitor and Camping Management Plan, which includes policy strategies in the form of amendments to 3 bylaws, the Camping, Traffic, and Park Use bylaws, to better mitigate impacts in sensitive areas during key seasons, as well as non-policy components of the plan, including formation of a visitor management roundtable with external stakeholders, hiring a seasonal visitor management coordinator, addition of public amenities, and enhanced public education resources for frontline staff. For example, handouts developed by our communications team for bylaw enforcement, RCMP, Conservation Officer Service, Squamish Nation, and Tourism Squamish staff to distribute. This presentation focuses mainly on the non-policy aspects of the plan, which were developed to support those policy components. As in previous years, the key questions guiding the collection of data throughout the visitor management season were as follows. We looked at what are the issues, so the issues of concern. We looked at where are the issues, the areas of concern. And we also looked at how often they're happening, so the frequency and patterns of behaviors. In terms of the issues of concern in 2022, as in previous seasons, visitor-related complaints to bylaw enforcement during the summer were focused mainly on camping in unsanctioned areas. During the 2022 visitor season, the following key issues were also identified. Management of human waste, wildlife attractants, mainly garbage, and illegal campfires. These issues are illustrated in the chart before you, which shows an increase in complaints about these issues throughout the summer months. In terms of areas of concern, camping infractions and complaints were distributed throughout Squamish, similarly to 2021. In both seasons, the downtown drew the most complaints and infractions, followed by the industrial park area, which includes the Spit Road. There was a reduction in complaints in most other areas, most notably the Mamquam Forest Service Road. That being said, the volume of traffic on the Mamquam Forest Service Road, as picked up by traffic counters, continues to be very high, with over 1,100 vehicles on the July and August long weekends, indicating that camping and other activities may be pushed beyond the boundaries of the district further up that road. As the visitor management work continues for another season, it'll be important to continue to document and review these different trends. In terms of hotspots where unsanctioned camping was occurring, the downtown continued to be the main area, followed by the industrial park, as well as Brackendale. There were fewer complaints received during the 2022 season compared to 2021, which staff believe can partly be attributed to the proactive education and engagement work of both the bylaw community patrol officers as well as other organizations in the community like the Destination Stewards from Tourism Squamish. When we look at frequency and patterns of behavior, as in 2021, illegal camping infractions increased in frequency throughout the summer. This figure illustrates the rising trend of illegal camping over the summer months. And as mentioned in the last slide, compared to 2021, it appears there were fewer instances reported in terms of complaint in 2022. I wanted to touch on the Squamish Visitor Management Roundtable, which was established in 2021 with the intention of bringing all agencies conducting business in Squamish that deal with tourism and visitor traffic to share ideas and issues, provide resources and solutions, and ultimately mitigate the strain of high volumes of visitation and illegal camping during the summer months. This group meets bi-weekly between June and October, and then monthly between November and May, and is comprised of members from governmental and non-governmental stakeholder organizations here in our community. During the 2022 visitor season, the top issues that were discussed at the Squamish Visitor Management Roundtable included garbage, human waste, and wildlife attractants left by visitors, as well as unsanctioned camping, both inside and outside of the District of Squamish boundary. They also discussed events that bring large number of visitors to Squamish and how to manage those, high occupancy and zero vacancy rates at hotels on holiday weekends in July and August. Some of the top tools that were discussed around the table to mitigate issues related to visitors included the closure of Cat Lake and Levitt Lake due to a food condition bear. Ultimately, this resulted in the euthanization of that bear in August at Cat Lake. One of the other campaigns that was discussed at the beginning of the visitor management season last year was the Don't Love It to Death campaign shared by Tourism Squamish. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And one of the other tools included bylaw enforcement patrols with the community patrol officers, which were able to be deployed for longer shifts during 2022. As well as the Tourism Squamish stewards who are both educating visitors and residents around town on the benefits of respectful visitorship. So awareness, education, enforcement tools certainly have proved very effective in reducing unsanctioned camping in sensitive areas around the district. All of the district's enforcement actions have endeavored to achieve voluntary compliance, and the issuing of tickets is really a last resort method, and has only been required in the minority of cases. In 2022, during the peak visitor management season, there were 74 complaints that were received by the bylaw office regarding unsanctioned camping. About 30% of these were related to wildlife attractants being left out in illegal campsites. In addition, community patrol officers were able to identify over 200 incidents of unsanctioned camping throughout the community during proactive patrols in sensitive areas, and were able to provide education information about where it is permitted to camp in Squamish. The camping guide pamphlet, which you see here, was developed by district communications staff with input from partner organizations at the Visitor Management Roundtable, and is a tool that's distributed by bylaw staff, RCMP conservation officers, as well as destination tourism stewards to anybody who's camping in unsanctioned areas to be able to provide them with a resource of where they can find legal camping options. Regarding enforcement, only 4 fines were issued under the camping bylaw related to unsanctioned camping in public spaces. Under the traffic bylaw, there were 7 fines issued for camping on a district roadway, and 65 fines were issued for parking for over 72 hours in one location, as well as abandoned trailers and campers, and the illegal storage of campers and trailers on district roadways. There we go. To share some of the examples of messaging that was put out by both the district and community partners around visitor management. You can see here an example of social media messaging from the district. I also have the camping availability calendar, which is managed by Tourism Squamish, and is a very helpful resource for bylaw and destination stewards to use as a tool to help visitors to find camping options. I've also put an example up there from one of the partners at the Visitor Management Roundtable, the Squamish Access Society, which is working to educate their members on appropriate camping options within the community. As mentioned previously, the Don't Love It to Death campaign was an initiative by the Sea to Sky Destination Management Council that launched in 2022. This campaign is a reminder to outdoor enthusiasts and visitors enjoying the outdoors to be mindful of the impact of their behavior and activities that is happening in delicate ecosystems and communities. And so they had some quite creative messaging that they came up with consultation with other members in the visitor management roundtable. Staff also continue to monitor and connect with other communities with similar visitor management profiles. Similar visitor profiles. Some of these communities are piloting programs to help manage illegal camping. However, it should be noted that these communities also lack supportive shelter for people experiencing homelessness, unlike Squamish, which has the under one roof facility. These other communities also have a significant issue with a lack of seasonal workforce housing. Pilot projects include the Canmore Safe Park program for workers, which has seen limited uptake, unfortunately, as well as a temporary use permit program for summer staff in both Tofino and Ucluelet. Now turning to the campground, which we wanted to include in this presentation. The District of Squamish Municipal Campground operated until the fall of 2019 and then opened for a short time during the COVID-19 pandemic. During 2021, the district decided to open the campground only for special events. However, it was also used for recreational programming as needed. This continued into the 2022 season. For the 2023 season, the municipal campground is booked until July for events. Event organizers are responsible for providing all necessary supports for camping, including managing sanitation and waste. From July, there's plans to again use the space for recreational programming, including summer camps, as well as potentially licensing it for a childcare operator to use for a fixed period. The District of Squamish Brennan Park Fields and Lands Master Plan also comes into effect later in 2023 and will impact the future of how the space is developed as the area is designated to be converted into a covered bike park, and special events camping is planned to be moved to a different future location within the master plan. Despite these current commitments for the site, staff have reviewed the possibility of reopening the municipal campground to individual users for camping. To do so safely and responsibly, the site would need to be upgraded, including provision of a holding tank for sewage management. In addition, staffing would be required to run the campground. Recreation and public works staff positions assigned to the campground in previous years proved not to be adequate to keep up to campground user demands. In order to operate the campground safely, camp host positions are proposed to be contracted to provide support and security 24 hours a day. Required site upgrade costs and estimated operating costs for the season, so from the May long weekend until the September long weekend, are broken down in the chart before you here. Given the current commitments for event camping and initiation of the Fields and Lands Master Plan, opening the campground to individual users for the 2023 season would have significant impacts to budget, staff capacity, as well as the district's endorsed organizational plans. Staff continue to discuss with the province the development of additional recreation sites, as well as expanding existing campgrounds to accommodate higher volumes of visitors in appropriate locations near Squamish in support of Council's advocacy efforts in 2021 and 2022 to the Ministry of Environment and BC Parks. So with that, staff have proposed 2 recommended resolutions to Council that Council received the Visitor and Camping Management Plan for 2022 for information, and that Council open the municipal campground for events only from May until July 2023, and for recreational and childcare programming from July until September 2023. Thank you, and I will hand it back to Council for any questions and discussion.
Thank you for the presentation. Council, are there questions? Mayor Herford?
Thank you for the report and the presentation. I was curious, all of the data ends in September, and it's on very much on an upward trajectory at that point. And I was wondering do we have any information on what September, October looks like? Like, I'm just trying to understand the curve and make sure that we're resourcing it appropriately in the timeframes.
Thank you. Through the chair. So partly that is because the visitor management coordinator who collates all of this data is only employed seasonally. The position is for about 3 days a week between May and September. We do know, looking at staff data from beyond that point and bylaw complaints in particular, that this did continue well into October. Last year was particularly warm weather, and so we did see lots of people still coming on weekends, and impacts in the community up until well into October.
So should we not then be looking at an expansion of that role to cover off the sort of the tail end of this season a bit more? So through September seems appropriate, or how, or not having that resource, how did staff deal with that through the September time where they didn't have that resource available?
Thank you. Through the chair. This was something that was considered for the 2023 budget cycle, was expanding the hours of that role and the time period. That being said, looking at the reduction in complaints in 2022 compared to 2021, staff did feel that it was worth having another season of data collection before bringing that recommendation forward to council for an increase in hours for that staff resource. And so the proposed plan is to continue to collect data this year to better understand whether 2021 was an anomaly year in terms of the demands on resources, whether the impacts of the non-policy and policy options that were put forward in 2021 were really having an effect in 2022, and then having 2023 as a data set to compare, to look for trends.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, thank you. A couple questions. In the resolution, municipal campground for events from May until July, is that sort of daytime use only, or does that include camping for those events? And then similarly, from July through September, might there be some camping associated with recreational childcare programming, or is it, no camping at all through either or one of those time periods?
Through the chair, I'll let Mr. Hoskin answer that one.
Thank you. Through the chair. There up till July, there could be some minor amounts of camping for events and sport festivals, that sort of thing. But after that time, no, there would not be any camping until a new campground is developed, and that would be more appropriate for those type of events.
Thank you. And then my second question is, Fortis and Woodfibre seem to still be trying to move ahead without housing plans secured. Even if Fortis was to get a temporary use permit, it seems that there might still be a number of workers wanting to just camp or do their own thing. What is our ability to scale our enforcement, adjust our fines and so on in short order? Like, is this something we need to be preparing for now, or we can sort of react if we see, complaints really start coming in and, impacts to vulnerable populations and our sort of desired visitors and so on?
Thank you, through the chair. That is something that the bylaw staff will be keeping a close eye on to see what those impacts are. I think at this point, with so many unknowns, it's challenging to bring forward amendments to any of our bylaws around that because we don't yet know what the impacts are, and because any changes would have impacts not just on workers who were breaking our bylaws from Fortis and WLNG, but on the wider population as well. So we would have to consider that very carefully. We do understand from conversations with other communities that have had projects like this that they have seen quite an impact on their campgrounds from workers coming from other places and using campgrounds as basically their temporary residences. And that in particular, campgrounds that are located within neighborhoods have had some negative effects from that population.
Councillor Anderson?
I just wanted to first ask for a couple of clarifications on the report. The listing or the table, camping complaints and infractions by issue and location, and one of those locations is Valleycliff. And my question is, does that encompass the Mamquam Forest Service Road and Squamish River riparian zone generally? What does Valleycliff refer to?
Thank you, through the chair. Valleycliff is actually focused more on the north side of the Squamish River. The Mamquam Forest Service Road complaints are collected specifically for that zone.
Thank you. The data is presented for, and this is data being collected by provincial agencies, among other partners, for the Mamquam Forest Service Road, as well as for the Squamish Valley Ilaho, the tree farm license. But there isn't mention of Ring Creek Forest Service Road. And I wonder if you might provide some background on that. The reason why I ask is because, and there is reference in the report to commercial operators on these roads. Well, the main commercial operator over the years ahead on the Ring Creek Forest Service Road will be the Squamish, District of Squamish Nation Joint Community Forest. And I just wonder whether it might be why that road may or may not be included at the present time. And perhaps I'm suggesting it may be of interest to, or maybe you could elaborate on the considerations around monitoring Ring Creek Forest Service Road.
Thank you, through the chair. The monitoring of those Forest Service roads is done, it was previously the Ministry of Forestry, the Rec Sites and Trails division. That's now been moved over to the Ministry of Environment. However, they are the ones who are collecting that with traffic counters, which are deployed on the Mamquam Forest Service Road and the Upper Squamish Valley Road, as you mentioned. My understanding is it's a combination of things, but I think primarily resourcing in terms of having those traffic counters deployed. They've put them in the areas where they think are best in terms of managing traffic volumes. Certainly through the Visitor Management Roundtable, we could pass on to them the desire for an additional one on the Ring Creek Forest Service Road.
Thank you. Perhaps that might be a consideration for the future. Finally, Your presentation refers to our council advocacy over the last couple of years vis-a-vis the province in identifying other appropriate locations on Crown land, naturally, surrounding Squamish in support of, and my question here is, I'll just relate that in our meeting with the ministry, representative council, last September, they went through a list of the sites under consideration, and in fact, discounting all of them and presenting a lot of challenges with them. But the one site that they did not address at all was Refuse Creek. And I wonder, I'm just curious, to your knowledge, is that under consideration in dialogues that you may be aware of? And I'm asking because perhaps it may be time to advance dialogue about some of these options. That one in particular straddles the Squamish Community Forest and the Tsleil-Waututh Forest License. So if we're going to have a dialogue about Refuse Creek, we should bring them in. But can we advance, or should we advance? To your knowledge, is discussion being advanced about Refuse Creek, the gravel quarry site there?
Thank you, through the chair. At this point, I believe the efforts have been focused more on looking at recreation in the Shannon Basin area by the province. That's been their main focus right now. Refuse Creek was discussed during several council members and the mayor's meeting at the UBCM conference last year as a potential option. But since then, we haven't heard any update on that. So that's, again, something that could be, we could request an update through the Visitor Management Roundtable and bring that back.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hamilton?
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks very much for the presentation. I think the use of our campground, the municipal campground, I think it's a difficult balance between serving our community through uses like day camps. I think that's very important to provide parents a facility to have their children taken care of when they're working during the summer, and our the benefits we gain from having visitors in town. We are a very tourist motivated community. And so I'd like to see if the staff could explore the possibility of opening up the campground to visitors during just the long weekends, the high camping volume weekends, so that we can reduce that impact of illegal camping in our community on those really high volume visitor weekends, and do it on a cost recovery basis. So the visitors are paying for the camping that they're using. Is that a possibility?
Thank you. Through the chair. It would be a challenge. We would either have to deliver a service through a contractor or through staff, and securing for only those days would definitely be a challenge and resource intensive to train and force and have that service just for a short amount of time. So essentially, it would be all expense with very little revenue to make that happen. So I anything is possible, but I would say that's would be a challenge.
Let's go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chair as well, it would require a budget amendment depending on the scale. I'm assuming it's not something we could absorb, and it would require a budget amendment to do even though if it was based on cost recovery, it still requires it go through the budget process. Yeah.
I have a couple questions. In terms of reducing the operational cost for the municipal campground, has the district considered composting toilets? Would that be appropriate for this usage?
It's going back a career or two, but yeah, composting toilets depends on the amount of usage, but they are very expensive. Certainly the most cost effective would be containment, like what do we call it? The big
Porta potties?
Well, not just a porta potty, but for long term, it would be a bigger basin that would hold the nasty stuff. Yeah.
And also in terms of, oh, sorry, did you have something?
I was just going to add my understanding as well from our public works staff is the other main concern is the gray water and dumping of gray water, because if you have campers that are there, camping composting toilets would sort of address part of the issue in terms of the sewage management, but in terms of gray water, you still run the risk, environmental risk of not having somewhere to appropriately dispose of that.
And also in terms of cost reduction, I was wondering if any self-registration system had been considered.
It has been considered. It would definitely affect the revenue. Even with proper enforcement, there is approximately 20% of people that don't pay. And when we wrapped up enforcement, we went from about 50% to 80%. So if it's completely voluntary, I would suggest that our revenue projections would need to be drastically adjusted.
And in terms of, we've spoken a bit about the upcoming campground that's going to be part of the Brennan Park project. I was wondering if there's what the estimate of when that would be operational would be.
Talking with our director of operations, I believe that bringing forward some budget costs for the 2024 budget cycle, so it can get into a 5-year plan. It does require removing the storage containers from the existing site, and then building if it's for events only, in a clear field that has proper drainage and a roadway in. So there are some substantial costs if it's even just for an event only site. If it's for a municipal campground site, then we are more obligated to provide more services, which is where the costs escalate, and that's the registration costs, enforcement costs, and maintenance to keep it safe.
Thank you. Councillor Pettengill?
I'm just wondering, and maybe this is for the future campground, but do we have any legal requirement if we have a municipal campground to allow any sort of vehicle? And where I'm going with this is, could we restrict it to only cars with or vehicles without water systems and tents? So then presumably you're avoiding, you have to put toilets, but you're avoiding gray water and so on because there's no sort of water system for people to dump. Is that sort of restriction or middle ground we can look towards?
Through the chair, it would be worth investigating, but it then creates obstacles for some folks to visit the campground, obviously. But I would suggest that what we would bring forward would be an escalating cost model and what would be a bare minimum to a properly managed municipal campground.
Councillor Hamilton?
Thanks very much. For me, the day camp, the daycare use, I think is very important. Is there an estimate for how many children will be accommodated in that use?
Yes, good question. Through the chair. So we have a contract in Instructor Healthy Hearts that was previously on the Easter Seals Camp, and we have them currently using the site, and they use or have approximately 100 kids going through the program or building towards that. In the summer, recreation and culture would be adding approximately 60 kids per week through summer programs. In addition, it's more of a minor, but our bike camps and other folks use the site as well.
Councillor French?
Thanks, Chair. And just following up on that last question and answer from Mr. Hoskins. So this period between July and September and the recreational and childcare programming that is contemplated, am I hearing correctly? This would be a mix of both District of Squamish, Brennan Park programming and private contractor use for child care / programming?
Correct. It is, but to clarify, it is all recreation and culture programming. We have different delivery models, some through staff, some through contract instructors. But for the public, they would view it as a recreation and culture program.
Mayor Herford?
Thank you. During that summer window, July to September, are there no community events that would benefit from this camping support over the weekend?
Certainly, historically, we've had quite a few sport festivals, and we see, well, perhaps on a weekly basis, is applications to use Brennan Park in different aspects. The challenge is balancing that event use with delivering childcare or child support programs. It is amplified as well with the Brennan Park renovations. So we don't believe the renovations will have a direct effect this year, but it will become more compounding as time goes on until we can move the campground and have enough area for programs and childcare.
Thank you. I understand sort of the midweek use for the childcare, but this sort of swelling in capacity to support the events, I think, is challenging to do without. So I'm curious to see how that goes this time around. But that July and August load, there's all of our data shows that the campgrounds are get full on the weekends through that time, making it hard to run these events. So these two pieces just seem, seeing that we have that asset, it seems that feels like we're under leveraging it for that time. But yeah, maybe that's just a comment, or what was staff's perspective on the events at that time, and what are we hearing from our event organizers in and around Brennan Park that generally have used this, or historically have used that facility to support their events in the past? Have we engaged with them, and what sort of alternate plans are being made that you're aware of?
Certainly through the Fields and Lands Master Plan process, the community was engaged on the long-term impacts. There may be opportunity, but it would have the trade-offs of potentially impacting child programming, is to accommodate just the local events or smaller scale events that wouldn't proceed beyond a weekend. I would be happy to take that back to the team and consider that, and I could update council if that could be a consideration.
Councillor Hamilton?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I think it would be a very good use of the space for special events through July and August. It seems to me like the day camps would be primarily Monday to Friday. Special events are going to be primarily weekends. I think it would be valuable if we could try to open it up for special event camping.
I have a couple more questions. The human waste issue seems to come up a lot around camping and around our parks, and I was wondering if the district currently has any plans to be installing more public toilets in public places.
Thank you, through the chair. So the district does seasonally deploy porta potties throughout the community, and did increase them in 2022. So there's obviously the trail hubs, which you're probably familiar with, which are at a number of the schools in different neighborhoods that come up seasonally, as well as other kind of hotspots to support recreation in those areas. In addition, we have other porta potties that get deployed out to sort of hotspots of high use every season. My understanding is that the Junction Park washrooms are being rebuilt and redesigned. That's part of council's, the financial plan at the moment. And beyond that, one of the initiatives that our communications team has put together is mapping of where all the public washroom locations are and when they're open throughout the community. So this is a resource that's accessible to community members, so they can figure out where there are toilets available to them, depending where they are in Squamish.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, as a mother of small children, I can have a few comments about not having porta potties in the winter. And also, I have friends with dogs who have some interesting experiences at our parks as well. So I just thought I'd, put that on the radar. And I was also wondering, with the use of the campground for child programming over the summer, I was wondering if there's any thought to pushing that into fall and or winter. I understand it's not like a great suitable place for camping in the winter time, but right now there are kind of outdoor education programs happening in like Ray Peters or Alice Lake, and I was wondering if the district had given any consideration to that.
Thank you. To make sure I understand the question, so to bring programming in throughout the fall in the park, we're certainly open to programming and expanding our programming. Our greatest challenge right now is staff and contractor resources. So we have been and will continue to be advertising and pushing for new programs, program ideas. We'll work with our staff and our contract instructors to have as long and as broad programming as needed. Certainly, the need drops in the fall. Most of our programming is directed during non-school days. And providing childcare for folks when kids are out of school.
Okay, thank you. Council, are there any more questions? Any comments? No? Okay, should we move to staff recommendation? Okay, seconded by Hamilton. Should we move for council to receive both?
Two separate.
Should we do them separately? Okay, so move to that council receive visitor management camping plan for updates and information. Yeah. Okay, and seconded by Hamilton. All right, and all in favor? Okay. And Council French, you'd like to move that council open them, or are you going to speak to it?
I have drafted something that I'd like for council to consider. So the motion would be that council open the municipal campground for events only from May until July 2023, and have that be its own distinct motion. And then I have another motion to follow regarding the second half of the staff recommendation.
Seconded by Mayor Herford. All in favor? I'm sorry. Okay, go for it.
So my thinking here is I've heard around the table that we all support the idea of using the municipal campground for events between May and July. And then my thought with the next motion would be to direct staff to come back to us with some recommendations of how we could accommodate weekend camping through July until September. So this motion is simply regarding events between May and July, and then I'll speak further to my thoughts on another motion.
Councillor Pettengill?
Sorry, can the mover just reread his motion, please?
Well, this motion is very simple. It's exactly what the staff have presented to us, that council open the municipal campground for events only from May until July 2023.
Councillor Anderson?
That's just offering a footnote, really. With respect to events only from May until July 2023, the Squamish Days long weekend, the BC Day long weekend, this year happens to fall in August. I believe it's August 5th, 6th. So in case that's of any noteworthiness.
Okay, do we have a seconder for Councillor French's motion? Yeah, oh yeah, Armin, okay, Councillor Mayor Herford. Okay, all in favor for that? Yeah, okay. And go again.
Okay, so the next motion that I have is that council directs staff to explore weekend event camping and recreational and childcare programming from July until September 2023 and report back to council.
Mayor Herbert?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to be a little bit more prescriptive with it if I, maybe I'll second it for a discussion and offer an amendment. Maybe that's the
Unless
path
you have-
forward.
Unless you have wording that,
Yeah, I'll try if you don't mind. Okay, so that so council open the municipal campground for recreational and childcare programming from July until September 2023, and develop policy that supports event use during that time, but prioritizing the childcare programming, just so that to help with the. Oh, sorry, and I will speak to it if seconded.
I'm prepared to second that, but I see that the CAO is trying to inject.
I'm apologize if I'm out of order here in the middle of a motion, but I believe that what will help council with this is if I have a 10-minute timeout to talk to staff about the events and the camping and the peak weekends and be able to wrap my head around that so that we can better inform you. And then you can consider a motion after that. Would that be appropriate?
I think so. Can we just, I believe Councillor Pettengill had something to say as well. And okay, would you like, does everybody, how's everybody feel about that? Sound good? Okay, yeah, let's take a little 10-minute recess. Thanks. Welcome back. And can we continue our discussion? So, what's that? Yes. Okay, Ms. Glenday?
Thank you through the chair. Appreciate the timeout so that we could achieve clarity at the staff level, which I think will help clarity with council. In terms of the motion that's in front of you, it talks about events until July, but then childcare programming until September. In speaking with staff, both events, if they're weekends only, so events, if they're weekends only, can go from May until end of September. So the life of the, or not the life, the season of the campground for the summer, as well as childcare programming. So you could amend the motion to include both as long as events are referred to as weekends only. And that way the childcare programming is Monday to Friday, camping for events are on the weekends throughout the seasonality of the campground for 2023.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Herford.
Thank you. And the motion that I was contemplating was, and similar to Councillor French's as well, involved coming back to council or developing a policy. But what I've heard here is that can be accommodated, and that portion of the work doesn't need to happen. So we can just have a new motion that encompasses the weekend only aspect. And with that definition of weekend only, would the childcare programming run till 3 or 5 o'clock, like some point in the afternoon, and then that Friday night could be in play without too much of a hassle for those special events?
Through the chair, short answer is yes. So the key part is that without impacting the child programming is child programming up to Friday afternoon, evening, and then it would be open up for licensing. That means a license with the District of Squamish. So they would be responsible for providing the services. And then they would need to be out of the site by late Sunday afternoon, and then programming could take place again on the Monday.
Thank you. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll hazard a motion which is slightly different than the first one. So that council open the municipal campground for recreational and childcare programming and weekend-only event use from July until September 2023. Oh yeah. So, okay, one more time. That council open the municipal campground for recreational and childcare programming and weekend-only camping use to support events from July until September 2023.
Okay, seconded by Councillor French.
I'll speak to it. Thank you. I think this is our municipal campground is an important asset to support our community events, and our data does support that we are at or over capacity in all of our camping facilities in our community during weekends. So I think that this is an important step to ensure that we have that we can support our community events, and the child care use there, I think, is incredibly important for our community as well. So I hope that this strikes a good balance between both of those community objectives. I'm happy to support, and thank you for your support.
Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. And in speaking in favor of this motion, I'm reflecting on what is currently happening in the city of Vancouver right now on Hastings Street, where we're seeing a very unfortunate scenario that is challenging for everybody. And part of what we're doing here today is potentially avoiding a situation in Squamish like the one that we're currently seeing on Hastings Street. And then having said that, I'm particularly mindful of the Squamish Days Lager Sports Weekend and ensuring that that event has ample parking opportunity or camping opportunities, because many of the people who come to participate in that weekend come here specifically with camping as their accommodation plan. And I think that it's also worth pointing out at this point that one of the reasons we're taking this direction is we've learned that the municipal campground is best suited as special events camping only. And in regard to that, there are water access limits, and of particular note, the winter shutoff that traditionally happens at the municipal campground, limited staffing, and water pooling in the off season. I think that this motion basically takes care of all of those concerns, and I feel that this is the best direction for that facility this summer.
Councillor Pettengill.
Yeah, I'll support this. And my comments are sort of to the topic a little bit. I maybe should have made some of them at the first resolution. I just wasn't quick enough. But I do think we need to be ready to scale our enforcement efforts this year. And so I just hope that staff can start putting our minds to what that might mean. I understand we don't want to proceed too far without sort of knowing exactly what we're reacting to, but it seems like we may have a situation we need to react to quite quickly and significantly. Otherwise, we may see impacts from Fortis and wood fiber, quite detrimental impacts to a large portion of our community and economy. So I think we need to be ready for that. I am supportive of long weekend event camping throughout the summer. As I've watched these discussions, it is really hard to separate the sorts of camping and the needs and why people are camping. I think we know we have a model that works for this event sort of camping, and we're prepared to do that, and there's a need there. So I think we should do that. I don't want to discount, though, there is a whole other just housing discussion, and I think that requires more work, and we're going to have some conversation about it this afternoon. I don't think we're in a position to tackle that at this location this year, but that is a topic that I think needs more consideration. So by supporting this, it's not a discounting of that. I just think where we are right now, again, this is the path forward for this location this year, and we need to put more effort in the other topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments? I'm happy to support this motion about two things that I care deeply about: childcare access and access to camping. So I just want to thank staff for all their hard work in putting these reports and ideas together. And with that, I will pose the question. All in favor to that triumphant music? Thank you. Okay. Motion passed. Okay, moving on to our next order of business, I believe. Thank you. Yeah, right. We're going to talk about the Cheekeye fan development and debris flow mitigation update in a minute. Hey, we good to go? All right, we're going to talk about the Cheekeye fan development and debris flow mitigation update. Thanks.
Good morning, Chair and Council. My name is David Roulston. I'm the Manager of Municipal Infrastructure with the District of Squamish, and I've been leading the debris flow, hazard, and mitigation review for the district. And I am joined by Alex Strouth, who is a geological engineer and engineer of record for the proposed Cheekeye fan debris barrier that we'll be discussing today. And also Jenny Green, who is an engineer and project manager working for Squamish Sea to Sky Developments, or SSSD, which is a partnership between Matthews West and Squamish Nation. And I'm also joined by a number of district staff, including Jonas Velaniskis, Director of Planning, Heather Boxrud, Chief Financial Officer, Sarah Bailey, Director of Engineering, Dave Merrow, Director of Major Projects, and Rianne Souza, Director of Financial Operations, who are all available for any questions. And there's also a number of other members from SSSD, John Matthews here at the table, President of SSSD. So Jenny and Alex have a brief presentation to provide Council with an update on project activities for the proposed Cheekeye fan development, with an emphasis on the Cheekeye River debris flow risk mitigation. The project has recently reached a major milestone in advancing the detailed design to a stage where it has been reviewed by an independent expert panel that has been engaged by the District of Squamish, Province of BC, and Squamish Nation. And in their letter of opinion, the review panel concluded that the design has been completed to the expected standard of practice for this stage of the project. So this is a major milestone for this project, which has been ongoing for the past 10 years. And SSSD are continuing to advance work on the project in order to address conditions that have been established by the district that must be met prior to adoption of the rezoning and OCP amendment bylaws. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jenny and Alex, who will be leading you through a presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, David. As David mentioned, my name is Jenny Green with SSSD. Nice to meet you all. So yeah, thanks for that intro, David. The intention of today really is to give Council an update on this project. As David mentioned, it is ongoing for the last 10 years. I believe the last time this project was at Council was in 2021 for an update on the hazard mitigation piece, and prior to that was for third reading, which happened in 2018. So, you know, we're coming up on 5 years. That's not to say there hasn't been work done in those 5 years. We've been very busy, and we wanted to give council an update in advance of coming back to request adoption of those bylaws later in 2023. So my plan is to speak, I'll speak for about 30 minutes, I think, maybe 20 to 30 minutes. Alex and I will present about 12 slides. And then my hope is that we can really use the rest of the time as a committee meeting to answer questions that some of the new councillors may have, and existing councillors as well, because like I said, it's been a long time since we've been at this table, and get feedback from you and thoughts on where we're at. So I will, this guy.
Oops. So you should just feel the
Just hit the arrow?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we'll talk a little bit about the project routes. Just briefly, I think most people are aware of the Cheekeye Fan project. It has been around for a while. I'll touch on some of those conditions for rezoning adoption. So there's conditions that relate to the actual land development itself, and then some that relate to specifically to the hazard mitigation work. I'll hand it over to Alex to talk about the barrier design from an engineering perspective, and as well as the independent engineering review panel process that David alluded to. I'll talk about the environmental studies that have been completed in the last 3 to 4 years to support our environmental permitting. Also archaeological studies that we've done. A quick update on the permitting status and our schedule, and then, like I said, we'll open the floor up for questions on either related to the land development itself or the hazard mitigation. Okay. So the Cheekeye fan, as most of you know, it is one of the most studied alluvial fans in Canada, North America, if not the world. And there is a current risk of debris flow, a current unacceptable risk of a debris flow on the Cheekeye fan that would impact the communities, the community of Brackendale mostly, as well as the First Nations reserves at the Cheekeye-Cheakamus confluence. So a debris flow is essentially a very, very fast moving landslide. Alex describes it as wet concrete that travels faster than a person can run. So it's not just fast moving water, it is fast moving material that travels at quite a high velocity and can create significant impact. So this studies on this hazard date back, I think there were development plans here in 1980 that they said, no, not until we figure out this problem, fix this problem. So a number of expert panels concluded that, before any future development can happen on the fan, this risk needs to be mitigated. And the district concluded in their assessment back in 2016, I believe, that the best way to do that is to fund the construction of a debris flow barrier through new development. What's this?
Let's try again.
Okay. What's the next? We missed one. No, we didn't. Okay. Sorry, getting used to computers. So briefly, this is an image that most of you will have seen before. This is the Cheekeye River Development's land development project as proposed at third reading. So this was presented to council back in 2018. So the Cheekeye Fan Development Project includes 1,215 housing units, including 170 affordable and market rental housing units, commercial and daycare space throughout, playground, park, and trail upgrades, major extensions and upgrades to the Ray Peters Trail and Ross Road, central transit node, car share, charging stations, cash contributions, and of course the construction of the debris flow barrier. Originally submitted in 2013, SSSD has worked super closely with staff and council to allow this development to evolve. It started in 2013 as an application for 750 single family homes. As everybody here knows, the climate has changed, and we definitely need to change with it. So the most recent application, the one that's at third reading, has a mix of housing units, rental units, and a number of other things. So the focus of today is mostly to talk about the hazard mitigation, but we are certainly open to discuss any aspects of the land development itself. So 2013, the rezoning applications were submitted. From 2013 to 2016, there were 2 expert panel reports that quantified both the hazard of the debris flow on the Cheekeye fan and worked to develop risk tolerance criteria for essentially what development could proceed. In 2014, we started to look at, is it technically feasible to even build a barrier that can reduce that risk? Did some preliminary site investigations and environmental work. In 2015, BGC started their hazard and risk assessments. And then following third reading of the rezoning bylaws in 2018, the SSSD was confident to move forward with detailed design of the barrier. So that started with detailed site investigations in 2019, and then 2020 through 2023, detailed engineering work, supporting studies, which leads us to kind of where we're at today, which is in mostly a permitting process. So in order to build the barrier, there's 3 levels of government: local, federal, provincial, and federal, obviously. So we're currently in that phase of the project. And the goal of the project is to complete that work in 2023, request adoption of the bylaws at the end of this year, and then begin construction on the barrier shortly thereafter. Don't think I have missed anything on that one. So the conditions for adoption. This report, third reading was given to the project on July 24th of 2018. Prior to that, there were 2 public hearings around both the land development and the hazard mitigation. The adoption is subject to 13 conditions, 5 related to the land development piece itself, and 8 related to the debris flow hazard mitigation piece. And SSSD has been working through these conditions over the last 5 years, and we expect to be in a position to request adoption in summer of this year. Not sure exactly when. Some of those will depend on, like I said, other layers of permitting, but hopefully at some point in the near future, we'll come back and say we've checked all the boxes. Here's an update on that. So quickly to talk about on the land development side, I talked a little bit about it in the previous slide. Essentially, we will enter into a land development agreement and commit to a number of things with respect to providing affordable housing, providing commercial and daycare spaces, water and sewer improvements, updates to our traffic study, following environmental recommendations, there'll be a noise covenant. There's a number of things in there. Essentially, right now, we have a draft land development agreement that's being reviewed by staff, and we're working closely with staff to get that into a position that it's ready to be presented to you. On the hazard mitigation side, again, we've spent quite a lot of time over the last 3 years working on the detailed design of the barrier and all the environmental permits that go along with those. So the things that are outstanding from a hazard mitigation perspective, again, the required 10-year permits and approvals from all 3 layers of government, those are all in queue. So they've all been submitted, and now we are essentially waiting for feedback from government officials on those. We've completed our environmental impact assessments. We've completed an operations and maintenance manual and operations and maintenance cost estimate, as well as a post-event restoration plan, capital cost estimate, and funding models. We've also developed an operations and maintenance funding model. So as council would be aware, the district will own and operate this barrier in perpetuity. And along with that comes a significant cost. So we've developed an operations and maintenance funding model, which allows staff to to see the kind of the financial requirements on an annual basis and set tax rates for that. The last time the project was before council, there was quite a lot of discussion on whether that would be funded through general revenue or through a local area service charge. The model that we've developed allows staff to select the percentage and decide what levels of taxation is required, build up reserves. Essentially, it's an interactive model that will be very valuable in the future of operating the barrier. We expect to present the O&M model to council sometime in the next couple of months. It's, I'd say, 95% of the way there. We're waiting on a number of one key piece to fill into that, which is around like long-term insurance. And once that happens, we expect we'll be able to present that model to council for input and feedback. The model has been, we've worked with engineering and finance staff on that. So we're hopeful that that will come together in the coming months. And then that will be kind of the last piece of the pie from a conditions on the hazard mitigation side. I think that will, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex from BGC Engineering right now to discuss a little bit about the design of the barrier and the review board process. And then when Alex is finished, I will finish up with a little bit on our environmental and permitting work.
Thanks, Ginny. As Ginny said, my name is Alex Strouth, and I'm representing quite a large design team. I'm just one of the members of that team. I've been working on this design. This is my 10th year working on the Cheekeye debris flow barrier design. So it's been quite the process, and I'll just quickly walk you through that process. So when we started in 2014, the question was really just, is it possible to build a barrier that meets the risk tolerance thresholds and the guidelines? And we learned pretty quickly that yes, it is. And since that time, we've really just been iterating and improving the design and looking at options and making sure that the design that we have today is really the best that it can be to meet all of the different project objectives. And the way that we went about this was to seek expertise from around the world. So in 2014, we traveled to Europe and met with Austrian experts, and we had an Austrian expert come here. And that's, I'm not sure if the image of the barrier is still on the screen, but that's really where we first heard about the importance of having this vertical opening through the barrier. We compared this to other options that we saw in Japan. So for example, in Japan, the common approach would be to build a series of small check dams up the channel. But we heard about the environmental impacts of that and the fact that prevents fish passage and requires lots of damage to the creek. And we learned that, well, this is where the designs in Japan as well as in Europe are moving, is to have a single or less number of barriers, so you reduce your impact there, and have a vertical opening that always allows the river to pass. We also learned about the way that barriers have failed in other countries, and we learned that the primary mechanism for failure is through erosion. So if you have a barrier that's overtopped, you get erosion on the sides, and then the flow goes around the outside of the barrier, and the barrier just stays there in the middle. And we learned about sometimes the flow goes over the top of the barrier and erodes the toe, and then that causes the barrier to fail. And so these little details that you see on the image there are really to protect from these different failure mechanisms. So we have the edges of the barrier be high so that the flow has to spill into the middle of the channel. We have that outlet in the spillway so that it's spilling onto rock so that it protects the toe of the barrier. And we've used a material called roller compacted concrete that is commonly used on thousands of structures across Japan that resists erosion and allows it to be built and so that it's a single, basically concrete monolith that if it's overtopped, it's not going to be eroded away. So that process happened iteratively. We started with one design. We showed it to the review panel, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next moment. We showed it to experts from around the world and received their feedback and improved the design at each step. And that's what I've been doing for like the last half of my career, I guess. And then we've applied a lot of what we've learned for this project to other projects around the province. So it's really been a great opportunity to build expertise in debris flow mitigation design. Next slide, yeah. So I mentioned the iterative nature of the design. From 2014 until about 2018, we were kind of working on the general concepts and trying to build a model of what the general barrier would look like, which is this concrete structure with an opening through it. But since 2018, we've been working on the details. So how wide should that opening be? How much material can we allow downstream? Where exactly should the opening be located on the structure? And all of that work has happened with the, I guess, oversight of this independent engineering review panel, as well as the province and the district. And David's been involved in that whole process. And the way we've built the design is we started with the risk tolerance threshold that was defined by the district. And we've come up with a design that meets that risk tolerance threshold, essentially. And the process was at the top of the list there of documents. We started with a baseline risk assessment in which we estimated what is the risk to the current population and what would the risk be to the proposed development without the barrier. And then that helped us to see how much we needed to reduce the risk with the barrier. And so the following work was related to ensuring that the barrier we propose does reduce the risk as far as is reasonably practicable. So we looked at many other options, and we found that there's really nothing else that you could reasonably build to further reduce the risk. And then most recently, we've been working on the detailed design drawings and specifications that will be used for construction of the structure. And the review of that work was completed in December, just this past December. And now we're working with the contractor as they prepare the cost and pricing for construction. So that's where we're at. And I just wanted to impress upon the group how this is something that's been going on for a long time and has been reviewed at each step of the way. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So I expect, hopefully, I think a lot of questions around, there will be some questions for Alex on the actual detailed design. So without having him go into all those details right now, we'll save that for questions. With respect to environmental studies, so one thing that is really unique about this project and the way that BGC did their design work was we had our environmental consultants involved early on. Typically with engineering projects, maybe not typically, but oftentimes the design is completed and then submitted for environmental permitting. And not a lot of thought goes into it at the kind of structural or civil engineering design stage. This barrier really focused on how can we minimize the downstream impacts. Because while the Cheekeye River is not a particularly high value resource with respect to fish and fish habitat, it's an active debris flow channel. It's not a place fish like to hang out. It does connect to both the Cheekeye and Squamish rivers, which, as everyone knows, are very, very high value and high quality fish habitat. So we took a high level, we did an environmental assessment trigger analysis back in 2018. Essentially, is this project large enough to trigger a federal or a provincial environmental assessment? And it was concluded that it was not. None of the triggers under both the federal or provincial EA Act were met. So then we proceeded with essentially baseline environmental reporting of both fish and wildlife. We also have completed what's called a construction and environmental management plan. So essentially that's all of the factors that the contractor will take into consideration while they're doing construction. How we mitigate risk to downstream habitats, bird nesting, all of the things that will have to be taken into account. So that plan has been completed. It's in draft. It will be updated before construction. With respect to the baseline report, so we retained Ecofish Research to do this reporting for us. They've been collecting fish and fish habitat data on the Cheekeye River now for 4 years. And their baseline report concluded essentially that there would be no effects to fish and fish habitat would be low or negligible in their existence. And they in fact concluded on the contrary that the project is expected to protect fish, wildlife, and human populations downstream by preventing these large-scale events. So what we know is that the Cheekeye River has debris flows on a regular basis. Not all of them are large enough to be noticed by people living on the fan. But at some point, there will be an event that is larger than we have anticipated. And without a barrier in place, that will cause negative environmental impacts downstream. So with respect to environmental permitting, we have submitted our project to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We're going through an authorization process with them currently. We've also submitted through the Water Sustainability Act, this is the provincial environmental permitting process, for a change, working in the stream, essentially change in use approvals. And then additionally, the barrier is located just outside the district boundary, actually, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but we've also submitted a riparian development permit to the SLRD, who will approve that at the local level. The other kind of major piece of work that's not engineering related is the archaeological studies that we've done. So in 2014, we completed what's called an archaeological overview assessment. This is the really kind of high level look at the project area and footprint. That study determined that there was no areas of high concern, but to complete a more detailed analysis once you completed the design work. So that was updated in 2019, and then in the past year in 2022, we completed an archaeological impact assessment, which is a much more detailed look at the project footprint, especially the area right around the Cheekeye River. That AIA concluded that the area was found to have low archaeological potential. So that essentially means that the project can proceed, and during construction, we'll operate under what's called a chance find management plan, which is a kind of a common thing in construction projects. If any archaeological artifacts or evidence of cultural sites are found during construction, there will be a management plan in place to, isolate and deal with those in the field. So just a couple more slides, I think 2 more. I've kind of touched on all of this, but so for our barrier permitting status, really we're at the point in the project where once our permits hopefully come through, we'll be in a position to come back to request adoption of the bylaws. Those include our Crown Land tenure application. That's through the province, the right to build the structure and operate the structure long-term on the land. That tenure will be, we've applied on behalf of the district, so that tenure is in the name of the District of Squamish. This includes the 3 water applications to be able to use water from the Cheekeye during construction and to actually have the structure in the river. The Heritage Conservation Branch approval is the archaeological piece. The project has involved a significant amount of consultation and referral. So we've been working with our Squamish Nation partners throughout. We've also been working with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation throughout, as well as a number of overlapping land tenure holders in the area. So the area is heavily used by mountain bikers, recreation users. Squamish Community Forest has tenure there. BC Hydro's got a power line in the area. There's a number of interested parties who we work with throughout. Of course, the District of Squamish rezoning conditions that we've been working to address. The SLRD will require 2 development permits, one for riparian and one for wildfire. The wildfire permit will be submitted when we have a better idea of if there's going to be any need for it. They've identified it, but we haven't submitted it yet because we don't know exactly where things will be on the site. And then, of course, the detailed design's been completed and kind of given the green light by the IERP, and we're working with DFO on that authorization piece. So our tentative schedule, like I briefly mentioned at the beginning, throughout the rest of 2023, we're hoping to secure the final permits that we need. The community forest, Squamish Community Forest will be working in the area at some point this year. We're not sure when, but they will be in that area. So that's a piece of our project that we'll be able to watch as they gain access to the basin. We're thinking sometime this summer, hopefully, for adoption of those bylaws, and then beginning construction in the fall of 2023. The construction is expected to take between 2.5 and 3 years. And so, substantially complete 2025, 2026. Of course, all this is subject to change depending on permitting, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So that's the end of my formal presentation, and I think I was pretty close to my 30 minutes, 29, 21, 22. So what I'd like to do now is, just use the rest of the time to address questions from council, and if there's any other information that we can provide at this time, we'd be happy to.
Thanks for that presentation. Council, are there any questions? Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. I think before this weekend, I didn't realize that I had an inner engineer geek. I went down some rabbit holes as I was going through this report, which is super comprehensive, very detailed, impressive. I was blown away by what was given to us to prepare for this meeting. So thank you for all of that, everybody that was involved. And what I'm finding myself wondering about now, after having this presentation and not recalling public access being addressed in any of the documentation, when this thing is completed, is the idea that people would actually be able to walk across this thing and have fairly free access?
Through the chair, yes, that was feedback that we received from, I think, a past council as well as from SORCA and other community organizations. So the barrier has been designed in such a way that there's a bridge over top of the vertical slot that would connect the Alice Lake Trail network with the Cat Lake Trail network. So there's still some details to work out in terms of site safety, and just general protection of the barrier. But yeah, the barrier has been designed to provide public access.
And my second question is just around working with, presenting to, consulting with the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District. Will the Regional District Board get this presentation or something like it in the near future?
Through the chair, we have been in discussions with the SLRD. I'm not sure to what extent we would be providing a presentation to them, but we have been providing referrals to them and awaiting feedback. And we expect that we'll require some form of assent from the SLRD in order to proceed with construction of the barrier. It is outside of the district boundaries, as Jenny mentioned. But the barrier is on Crown land, so we don't expect that the fact that it's outside of the district boundary to be a problem.
Councillor Hamilton.
Thank you very much for the very detailed engineering reports. I particularly actually found myself going down rabbit holes on risk tolerance thresholds. I found likelihood estimations very, it's maybe part of my background. I have two questions. First is, can you tell us about those, a little bit about the risk tolerance thresholds, just to give us an overview of what they are, how they're evaluated, and what the conclusions are. And second, I'd like to hear a little bit about the carbon impact of the combination of this massive concrete and obviously the development would be clearing a fair number of trees. Yeah, thanks.
Through the chair, I'll start off with a response to the first question and then maybe hand it over to Alex if he has anything to add. So with respect to risk tolerance criteria, the district's official community plan has defined our risk tolerance criteria, which is essentially, it's the risk to loss of life that we would deem acceptable both for existing development and also for new development. We have adopted a standard that is becoming a bit of a precedent internationally as well as nationally. So the District of North Vancouver, I believe, was the first jurisdiction in Canada to adopt that, and it was based on a system that was adopted in Hong Kong and other areas with landslide and debris flow risk. So essentially for existing development, the risk to loss of life is 1 in 10,000 in any given year. And for new development, it's 1 in 100,000. So it's a 10 times higher standard for new development in recognition that we have a choice to as to whether to put developments in place. And we also adopted that risk tolerance criteria based on a different expert review panel. So we've had a couple of expert review panels, or I suppose actually 3 expert review panels that have been convened over the past 10 years. The first one with regards to hazard and what magnitude of event to consider for debris flow. The second with respect to risk tolerance criteria, and this past one reviewing the mitigation design. So it's been thoroughly vetted. There's quite a precedent in terms of our risk tolerance. It's quite a high standard and a difficult one to achieve. And I'll hand it over to Alex to see if there's anything to add to that, and then also to address the greenhouse gas question.
So I want to add 2 things, I guess, just to put those numbers in context a bit. So first off, the risk tolerance thresholds that have been adopted by the district are the strictest risk tolerance thresholds that are used anywhere in the world. So there's no stricter one that anybody refers to. The reason that the expert panel felt that was appropriate is because the idea is to introduce new people into a hazard zone. And so they said, we're introducing new people, therefore we need to keep the strictest level that there is. So the risk level, the 1 in 10,000 for existing development, is similar to the risk of a person driving in a car. And so the idea is, let's make sure that the risk is no higher than what other risks that people are willing to tolerate. And the risk level of 1 in 100,000 is an order of magnitude less than that. And it's similar to the risk of somebody drowning. So it's something that is very unlikely. The group risk tolerance thresholds are the same that would be used if you were putting, say, a chemical factory into an existing neighborhood in a place like the UK or Hong Kong. So it's something that, you know, is very stringent and strict. And then there was the additional requirement to reduce risk to as low as reasonably practicable, which means that we implemented details into the design that are not cost effective. And in fact, they're grossly disproportionately not cost effective. So there's really no higher standard that could be set for the risk tolerance thresholds.
Can I just follow up on that for 1 second? The 1 in 10,000 per year, does, for example, the Brackendale community, the development that exists there, we do not meet that criteria. Is that correct? Because of the debris flow risk, correct?
That's correct. So the baseline risk assessment that has been completed by BGC confirmed that existing development currently has an unacceptable risk, meaning that the risk to loss of life is higher than that 1 in 10,000.
The greenhouse gas question we have not quantified.
Can I just follow up on that and ask what volume of concrete it will be?
Yeah, it's about 70,000 cubic meters of concrete. The things that we've done to mitigate the green or the carbon impacts are we're using the aggregate from site. So we're not going to be trucking aggregate from someplace else. We're using the material from site, processing it and placing it. So the carbon impacts would come from the production of the cement and then the transportation of the cement to site. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, we looked at many different designs of the barrier, of not the barrier, but designs of debris flow mitigation systems. And we chose the one that had the smallest impact, smallest footprint, as well as the smallest volume of all of the options that we had. And we also came up with a design that allowed the basin to be reforested. So it doesn't require that the basin has all of the trees removed from it. So after the construction, for example, the trees are allowed to regrow. So we have taken steps at each step along the way to try to minimize the environmental impacts and carbon impacts.
Councillor Anderson?
Thank you. Mr. Roulston, the report outlines a series of conditions that remain outstanding, and there's a reference here, I wonder if you might be able to clarify, it's condition 10F, off-site mitigation measures. Could you just give a little background as to what is meant in that phrasing?
Through the chair, so off-site meaning any mitigation that's not within the development site itself. So the off-site mitigation measure is the barrier. And then on-site mitigation is things like elevating structures to a flood construction level or providing erosion and scour protection for building foundations and things of that nature that would actually be on the development site.
Thank you. This may be a question for planning or engineering, and I'll just preface by saying that this afternoon we're going to be receiving a report, a housing report that offers the projection that we are going to see could see very considerable population growth in Squamish over the next decade and a half. So over the past couple of decades, from time to time, both the province and the district have given consideration to a bypass road around Squamish. And the sketched in, and I don't think that's anything more than a sketch, for the routing for that bypass road is the 1920s, 30s Maryland Ring Railway grade from, say, the Squamish River up to Cat Lake. The Maryland Ring had a trestle bridge very close to where this barrier is. My question is, and I see the notation or the reference to no net trails loss, so I have to wonder about, is there or should there be any consideration of the routing of a potential future bypass road in this vicinity, or are we comfortable that the present highway bridge over the Cheekeye, that would serve in future? Is there any merit in giving consideration to the potential future need or routing for a bypass road in this vicinity?
Through the chair, that's not an issue or an item that I am particularly familiar with. I'm not sure if planning has anything to add to that.
Hello, everyone. Jonas Olnisch is Director of Community Planning. Same response as David. It hasn't been considered. We haven't, in my time here, heard anything that I'm aware of from the Ministry of Transportation in the interest of that rerouting. And how it would interface with the Cheekeye project. So yeah, there's nothing really to report on that front.
Thank you. Maybe it's a matter of curiosity at this time, but in fact, a report has been cited recently in a community meeting that reminded us that a routing had been sketched in and was discussed both by the province and the district not too long ago. My third question concerns the funding model. And this is funding for operations and maintenance. And I understand from Ms. Green that this may be coming forward in coming months. And the report makes clear that the funding model, quote, must be approved by council. So we'll revisit this. But nonetheless, I recall during the 2018 public hearing that the Regional Forestry Association made a presentation because there were various scenarios. There are still various scenarios about the funding model and how to consider maybe a hybrid model between a tax. I'm not going to find it. But one of those scenarios that is still under active consideration is general taxation. That is, not just relying on the local area, the Cheekeye fan, but general taxation. And industry advocated consideration of that. for the reason that the industry, this regional industry, has seen a lot of redesignation and rezoning of lands that it's made use of in the past. And these are community decisions, not made by industry, but by the community. And so that came forward. My question is, when we consider conditions 7 and 8, this are the modeling results being proprietary and fair and reasonable price involved in that modeling information. Well, we have a number of present and future stakeholders in the Cheekeye Fan terrain hazard area. How are we taking into account these present and future stakeholders in this funding model? Are we going to be, or is anybody going to be surprised that they're all of a sudden going to be paying big bills to help pay this barrier, but haven't yet been involved in the discussion? Now, these Cheekeye Fan lands, of course, are going to be in demand. We've got a sawmiller that has needing to move lately and is moving to the Walmart parking lot. We've got a couple of people interested in greenhouses. We've got biomass conversion plant proposals. And we've got Squamish Nation business arms in the forestry sector, new people with new ideas asking questions. There's no question that the Cheekeye Fan is of strategic interest for industry in future. How are they being considered as we look to elaborate a funding model for this barrier? How are they being considered as stakeholders? Thank you.
Through the chair. So in 2018, when we had a discussion with council about the funding model, at that time, council approved in principle a split of funding roughly 50-50 between general taxation and a local service area to share the costs, recognizing that the barrier is not just protecting the development site, but it's also protecting the community of Brackendale. And even in an extreme event, debris flow could run out into the Garibaldi estates and impact businesses. So recognizing that there's a broad community benefit. And so the local service area, the proposal is that it would be confined to the development site, to the 1,215 units of the development site, and they would cover approximately 50% of the costs. And then the rest of the community would cover the remaining 50% of the costs. So that was what was agreed in principle. There is further work that's currently being done right now to refine the costs and to refine the funding model. And as Jenny mentioned, we're looking into details such as insurance. What is the cost of insurance for the barrier? And then how does that fit into the overall funding model? So that is all being reviewed actively. And I would say that through discussions, when we come back to council to discuss that funding model, that would be an opportunity for the broader community and stakeholders to provide input to that. You also made reference to providing modeling at a fair and reasonable price. So I just wanted to add, these are two separate issues. So that is with respect to kind of the proprietary information. SSSD has advanced the hazard modeling at their own costs and risk to this point. And so as part of the rezoning, we wanted to ensure that if stakeholders in the future wanted access to the work that has been done, that they would basically pay at cost. So for BGC, for the time that they would actually have to spend to complete modeling, but not that they would have to pay for costs that were incurred in the past. And so that's sort of the approach that we're taking, is that that becomes public information, but that they would still have to pay for work that would have to be done to utilize those results.
Thank you, Mr. Roulston. That's a very clear answer for my things I brought up. But Chair, I have a couple other questions, but I can wait until later if there is time.
Okay, that sounds good. How about Councillor Pettengill next?
Yeah, thank you. Pardon me. Just following up on some of the funding. In a June 2018 report, it spoke to referenced a number of costs. Were those just sort of order of magnitude, or is that sort of a fixed costs that are going into negotiations and we sort of agreed to them already? And I just, in the back of my mind, have all the cost escalations we've seen. So I'm just sort of understanding what the numbers in that report are. They we're sort of reevaluating them, or they're fixed?
Through the chair, the numbers have been, I think, refined slightly, but I would say that in 2018, they were far further advanced along than order of magnitude. I think we're still very consistent with the costs that were identified in 2018. There hasn't been any major changes to that. Jump in, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks, David. Through the chair, I just would comment, and this kind of addresses Councillor Anderson's comment as well. The O&M model, which we will love to share as soon as it's ready, is a really cool tool. It's interactive. It allows staff and those using it to select a bunch of different parameters. So you can toggle between 50% local area, 50% general revenue, and see what those impacts are on an annual per unit basis. The similar exercises that you would do when you do your annual budgeting for tax. There's a toggle for inflation. You can put on inflation and see what that impact is annually, and then see what that average annual impact is over a 100-year period. You can change the annual contribution to reserve. You can see what happens to the balance if there's no major events. So, for example, the O&M costs are estimated at the numbers Councillor Pettengill reference from July 2018, and I want to say it was around $700,000 or $800,000 annually was the number. That averages out debris flow events that could possibly happen, but you could go 20 years without an event that requires maintenance. So you can use the model to see that your reserve balance will accumulate quite quickly, assuming there's no major events. So it's a very cool tool that we've been working with staff on, so that staff will be able to take ownership of that and change it. We expect that in 5 years' time, once the barrier's been built and you've been operating it for 5 years, you may adjust those rates because you're collecting money faster than you thought, or not as fast, or so there's a whole bunch of really unique features in that model that I think will be handy for that. And with respect to future users on the fan, it would be, of course, up to council to decide how to change that tax over time. Removing a local area service or creating a new local area service, should you choose.
Okay, thank you. And I do have more questions about the model, but I'll save them till when we get that presentation. I'm just wondering, sort of, we, done a ton of engineering and research, and there's been a review panel. As a district, we will become the operator of this. What happens if it doesn't work? And so, like right now, and by that I mean where we decide, oh shoot, we actually need to do something different or much more substantial. Right now, we're not meeting our current risk tolerances. Are we sort of just in a similar situation because we have the review panel and everyone signed off on it? So it'd just sort of be kind of almost like where we are now. Or as the dike operator, might we find ourselves in a place where the province says, well, actually, you are now legally obligated to double the size of this district?
Through the chair. So I'm trying to think of a scenario where that could take place. And I suppose there could be like a changing of standards, risk tolerance standards internationally, or a change in regulation. I don't think that building this barrier would obligate the district to anything. I think that what's really happening is that this form of mitigation is being constructed by a third party, a developer, and so we have no obligation on our capital costs. I think as a local government, whether that barrier is in place or not, and a risk is identified, then generally, yes, the district is going to have an obligation to look at risk mitigation measures. But I don't think the construction of this barrier is really impacts any kind of future decisions that the district would have to make with respect to risk mitigation. I don't think we're taking on any additional risk by accepting this barrier.
Can I add? This has also been a key design objective, is to incorporate flexibility in how it's operated in the future. So most of the residual risk is related to the amount of debris that passes through that opening. And so one of the design details is that we have bars across that opening, and the spacing of those bars can be adjusted. So that's the primary toggle of what to control what the residual risk and also to control what the maintenance cost is. And it's flexible and we'll be able to adjust it in the future as we learn how it's performing.
Okay, just one more.
Yeah, and so going in a very different direction, I think I heard mention, that the housing context has changed, and maybe there'd be an opportunity for some discussion in the land development agreement. At least that's what I heard. And looking at Sanok, we've seen Squamish Nation put forth some really progressive solutions in terms of climate, affordability, and so on. And I guess I'm just wanting to understand if that was an invitation or expressing some openness to sort of explore sort of going a bit further in some of those areas. I'm presuming there's not a desire to, open a bunch of discussions that would delay things significantly, but I just sort of want to understand the context of that comment a little bit.
Through the chair, when I made that comment, my comment was more around the fact that when this project started in 2013, it was proposed as 750 single family lots, and that throughout the last 10 years that has changed. So where we landed in 2018 was with this mixed use development, 537 small and medium sized single family lots, 600 and I can't remember, multifamily townhouse condo developments. There's also a tiny home parcel commercial space. So I think with respect to the layout of the land development, that is now fixed as per third reading. But that was the culmination of 10 years of community input. And so I don't think there's much more to discuss in that realm.
Thanks. Mayor Herford?
Thank you. Thanks for the decade of work gone into this and probably decades of human hours into it. So my question's around the construction. So we've got quite a long period of construction. I appreciate the no net loss in trails, but during construction, how is that sort of recreation interface with the site? And the access to the site, which I'm assuming is from the south, which comes through it's a very busy area. How is that being accounted for during construction?
Through the chair, we are working on that kind of all the time. So we recognize that, the southern access through Ring Creek is a very, very heavily used recreation area. So we will work with the contractor on, we have a number of ideas that we're kind of talking about all the time. We meet with SORCA regularly, kind of on a monthly basis right now, to talk about different things that we can do in terms of like traffic management and traveling during off-peak times and those sorts of things. With respect to the construction site itself, as part of our kind of no net loss of trails, we will commit to building a couple of new trails. I can't remember how many. I think there's 3. And one of the plans is to actually build 2 of those new trails before construction starts so that we create those kind of continuous loops so that the area impacted doesn't really affect the trail experience during construction. So what I can tell you is, the Bob McIntosh Trail, for example, you will get to a point on it where you will run into a construction fence. It will stop. So we will, build a trail in advance of construction that will allow you to kind of continue your ride and loop up onto the bank. Same thing in the area where Made in the Shade is. It goes kind of steeply down into the basin. There'll be a loop there as well. So if you want to ride on kind of the other side of that hydro right of way during construction, you can do that. The area in the actual basin, like Dead End Loop, for example, will not be accessible during construction. We've kind of all conceded and agreed that that's not a good place to be during construction. The contractor will utilize a kind of site south of the barrier near the bottom of Michaela's Magic for their kind of lay down zone. That will be, fenced and controlled as any construction site. But contractors that we were talking with in Sorka, and we're all very aware of the the area and the use. So it's kind of an ongoing thing. We're working on a number of pieces to ensure that safety is the top priority during construction.
Just to add to that, we've received a proposal from SSSD, well, it's from SORCA really through SSSD, and they have reviewed the impacts of the barrier construction, both construction and post-construction, and they've provided a proposal to SSSD that includes the new trail package, trying to limit the scope and the area of construction activities. And you know, it's quite a detailed package to mitigate those impacts. We anticipate that that would form part of the land development agreement to ensure that their feedback has been taken into account.
Thank you. What sort of workforce is required to execute this?
Through the chair, in our conversations with the contractor, it's anticipated that on average, throughout the course of construction, there'll be just over 30 workforce on site. I mean, that's average, so more some days, less other days. And that's made up of kind of 90% contractor workforce and 10% engineering and environmental or district inspection, other people that could come to site from time to time. So 30 that would be on average on site on a regular work day.
Thank you. That's a lower number than I was anticipating to hear for such a large structure. So I'll step back from going into workforce accommodation. Although even those 30, you may need to give some consideration as to how they're housed, as this is a topic that other major projects in the community are pushing, which might make it a little bit harder for something as important as this to move forward. So I'll just sort of leave that comment there. So thank you very much.
I have a couple more questions. We're just about out of time here, but I have a couple quick ones. I just wanted to make sure, just to reiterate, there's not much concern about damaging fish habitat in the construction of this, right?
Chair, that's correct. The baseline environmental report was quite clear in that the habitat at the barrier construction site and upstream is of significantly lower quality based on the fact that it is an active debris fan. That being said, there are certainly aquatic and riparian impacts of the construction. So there will be destruction of aquatic and riparian habitat that can't be mitigated. I mean, it's a big footprint. Lots of those can be mitigated. That being said, we are working with DFO and the Squamish Nation on offsetting projects in the area to kind of account for that impact. But we've proven through the baseline report, and DFO has agreed that there are no concerns with fish and fish habitat at the site. And provided that we follow a rigorous construction environment management plan, which we've developed, that we can protect and isolate downstream habitats. So during construction, there will be on-site, like environmental monitoring throughout. We'll be measuring turbidity of this Cheekeye downstream, especially at the Brome confluence, the Cheekeye confluence. When we will be working within the creek bed itself, there are measures that the contractor can take to isolate that work zone in the event that, you know, there's spills, those sorts of things, so that doesn't travel downstream. So to answer your question, we are fairly confident that the construction operation of the barrier will not impact fish habitat.
Okay, thank you. And has there been any thought given to the impact of not having that debris no longer coming down into the rivers?
Yeah. Yeah, the impact, the most likely impact is we have, well, first off, we are allowing debris to come through, right? That's one of the main design features, is that we have this opening. So after an event, the river stays in the opening and it erodes the material in the basin and carries it downstream. So that was one of the main objectives, was to maintain that connection of sediment downstream for the riparian needs, I guess. But over the long term, there is a net reduction in the amount of material that goes downstream. And that is good for debris flow mitigation, because it creates space downstream to store debris if a large event occurs.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I can follow up on that. The design of the barrier is such that events up to, I think, 20 or 25 return year period, like those kind of smaller regular events that happen on the Cheekeye all the time, will continue to happen and nobody will notice. So the Cheekeye River will just flow through that slot. Sediment will get deposited down at the Cheekeye-Cheakamus confluence. The barrier will, it's like it's not there. And then when those events that have the potential to, cause impact, that's when the barrier does its job and that slot gets blocked. And then that sediment is prevented from traveling downstream.
Okay, thank you. I don't know. How strongly do you feel about your questions there, Eric?
Chair, I can wait and offer them as comments as briefly as I can.
Okay. Okay. And seconded by Councillor French. Would you like to speak to it?
Yeah, just thank you again to everyone involved in this project. This the issue of debris flow hazard here is the most documented and most studied debris flow hazard. So to be getting closer to positively impacting that, I think is truly remarkable. And I look forward to the upcoming discussions around the funding piece and just learning more as we go. But I think it's been it's been a great piece of work, and thank you so much for all your work and your presentation today.
Councillor Anderson?
This is truly a milestone. And not only in addressing, I'm going to cite the policy section of the staff report 11A out of the OCP, but looking forward to section 11.14 in the OCP, which is the future, a future sub-area plan for the Cheekeye fan. We can now, this milestone is also important for that next step in our employment lands planning for the future, and that is just so important. The other point I wanted to make is that the Heritage Conservation Branch, and there's been reference to archaeological studies as well as to water diversions, and those will probably be addressed, no doubt, in your water applications to the province and what they may involve, we haven't addressed today. But the Heritage Conservation Branch is broadening the scope of what they consider in legislation to include industrial archaeology. And at the junction of Brome Creek and the Cheekeye River on the north side, the big flat there, is the Squamish Timber Camp. And that has had significant Squamish Nation community involvement. Chief Long George, Dominic Charlie, among others, were active participants in that company and its operations, and that is most definitely an archaeological site. Just in case the water diversion schemes that we may address in future might be that far downstream or affect that far downstream. In future, I'll also look forward to maybe the next presentation in the development stats slide here. One thing that I was uncertain about whether it was covered at third reading was the proposed business park on the west side of Government Road, and whether that is under active planning. That's at the west side of the intersection with Ross Road. There's about a 16-acre parcel there, because our business park is full. And I suggest we should, that it would be a good idea to look forward to planning that component of the proposed development. And I'm not sure of its status in your plans at the present time, but we'll look forward to that discussion in future as well. Thank you.
Councillor Hamilton?
Yeah, thanks very much for this presentation. I did find myself geeking out a fair amount over this material. So thank you very much for all the details, the engineering details. As I am not an engineer, but I certainly appreciate and enjoy reading them. I absolutely support us getting this debris flow barrier in place. I think it's an important milestone, not just for new development, but for our community as it already stands. I would like to see, however, some greenhouse gas emission estimates from the construction of the barrier. Thanks.
Any further comments? Okay, then I'll ask the question. All in favor? Okay. Unanimous? All right. Thank you so much for coming to council. And with that, we will recess for lunch. Okay, welcome back to our committee of the whole meeting on April 23rd. And we're gonna talk about the 2023 District of Squamish Housing Needs Report. Take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor or Acting Mayor and Council. My name is Matt Gunn. I'm a planner here at the District of Squamish. With me is
Jonas Olniszka, Director of Community Planning.
And also we have do we have Julia online from City Spaces Consulting? Has she been able to join?
Yes.
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
Hi, yeah, and with us is Julia from City Spaces Consulting, who was the consultant that authored the report. Today, we are presenting the 2023 District of Squamish Housing Needs Report. Wait, are we projecting up here? Is the slide, are you guys seeing the slideshow?
No, it'll show up over there.
Okay. It says end slideshow, so. There we go. Oh, we got the speaker notes.
Wrong.
Something's wrong.
How you guys switch the screens?
Um,
You know how you share that?
no.
No.
Do you want to?
Please.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One day we'll learn.
Okay.
Thought I could.
All good.
It's just who Good, right?
Thanks. Thank you very much. Provincial legislation requires that local governments prepare housing needs reports. In 2018, Squamish completed our first housing needs report. However, in 2019, provincial legislation prescribed some mandatory specific content for these reports, which our 2018 report did not address. Staff retained City Space Consulting recently to complete an updated report as required by the legislation in accordance with the prescribed methodology. That report is now complete and is what we are presenting today. The role of council at this time is to receive the report as information, but because the report is prepared according to provincial methodology, our role is not to debate the findings of the report. One note I want to make just at the outset, the population numbers that the district normally references in communication with the community are generally the census agglomeration, which include all First Nations reserves. But in this case, the report does not include the population on reserve land, which is in alignment with the provincial methodology. So some of the numbers are different than some of the numbers we typically use. The presentation I'm giving today focuses on key findings included in the executive summary of the report. I'll start with some details about the current housing context and changes that were identified during the last census period. As we probably all know here, the annual growth rate in Squamish has been very high. It's been close to 3 times the provincial average over the last census period. A high growth population projection for Squamish could see approximately 24,000 new residents between 2016 and 2036. Housing costs currently exceed what most low and moderate income households can afford. As of January 2023, 25% of households spend more than 30% of their income on housing. In January 2023, the average apartment cost $581,000, and in October 2022, the average one-bedroom purpose-built rental unit cost over $1,400 per month. Between 2016 and 2021 census figures, household earnings more than $150,000 per year have doubled from 10% to 21%. The proportion of renters living in overcrowded or unaffordable housing has increased, and the proportion of households in core housing need declined between 2016 and 2021 from 7.2 to 6.4%. meaning fewer people are living in core housing need. The report identified a number of high-level themes related to housing needs in our community. There is a need for larger, ground-oriented, family-friendly, affordable rental units. Rental vacancy rates remain below 1%, and renter households have limited choices. There's a lack of new townhouse development in Squamish. Apart from the Garibaldi Springs development, there's been very limited new townhouse construction in recent years. The need for non-market housing remains. As of March 2022, 84 applicants are on BC Housing's waitlist for non-market housing. And there's a growing need for senior housing with varying levels of support, including assisted living and long-term care options. There are limited senior housing options in the community, and West Winds, which was recently concluded, has waitlists in place. And housing is needed with higher levels of support for complex mental health and substance use challenges. One of the key outputs of the Housing Needs Report is the Housing Unit Needs Estimate from 2021 to 2031, which are currently on screen. The chart identifies the number of units organized by dwelling unit bedroom numbers that are required by 2031 to meet the anticipated demand for housing in Squamish while addressing the existing deficit. By 2031, 6,840 additional units would be needed to maintain the income and housing diversity. 43%, or 2,950 of these units would need to be 3+ bedrooms, and 24%, or 1,640, will need to serve households earning less than $45,000 per year, representing the low and very low income groups. In order to meet these needs, approximately 685 units need to be completed each year between 2021 and 2031. Of these, 367 units per year need to have 3 or more bedrooms, and 205 units per year need to serve households earning less than $45,000 per year, the low and very low income groups. Looking at recent housing creation, according to census figures, between 2016 and 2021, an average of 386 dwelling units were created each year, which is significantly below the annual output required or identified as need by the Housing Needs Report. As context for understanding the projected housing needs outlined in the Housing Needs Assessment, staff did complete a high-level review of dwelling units currently permitted under existing zoning on greenfield and brownfield properties subject to recent development applications. These properties have adopted zoning that all allow for residential development. However, construction of these units will span several years. Many units are not expected to be completed in the 8-year timeframe of the housing unit needs estimates. There are also a number of lands within the growth management boundary under consideration for development that are not included in the above table, but those are outlined in the staff report. But under current zoning, we currently have across the community zoning for 4,372 apartment units, 1,344 townhouse units, and then a minimal number of duplex and detached single family, 20 and 35 units. The staff recommendation is that Council receive the 2023 District of Squamish Housing Needs Report from Community Planning, dated April 11th, 2023, for information.
Thank you. Council, are there questions? Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, thanks. Councillor Stoner had reminded me offline about the McPhail report, and I guess it suggests some changes to the provincial methodology for these reports in that if we follow the provincial methodology, I think their words is it bakes in the current level of affordability or unaffordability. And if you want to make a dent in that, you actually need to go build significantly more housing. So I'm just wondering, did we stick to the provincial methodology, or did we go and take some of those recommendations? And if we didn't, what's required, or what's our ability sort of from a legal perspective to take some of those McPhail report recommendations the next time we do this and sort of skew the numbers to actually address affordability?
That's a good question. It might be one that Julia from CitySpace, do you have any comments related to that or any insight into different methodological approaches and what may occur in the future?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I guess at a high level, the Housing Needs Report legislation doesn't include a methodology to calculate housing unit need estimates. So what we've been using for the process of our own internal housing needs reports that we've been working on over the last few years is what's been produced by the HEART team out of UBC. So there's information about this group in their report, but this is kind of a consortium that's been funded through CMHC that has researchers and data analysts that are working out of UBC to create a new methodology to provide a better estimate of housing unit need estimates. But I think there's recognition that even the HEART methodology is somewhat limited. So this piece of work is so evolving right now. The province just issued an RFP to create a methodology that will be used in conjunction with the Housing Supply Act and applied to particular municipalities. So we're all very curious to see what gets developed out of that process. But right now, we believe kind of the best standard that we have available is the HEART approach, because it does address some of those pieces that were outlined in the McPhail report, while recognizing again that housing unit need estimates are this challenging piece to sort of specifically say, well, if you deliver exactly this many units, you'll be good. I think focusing on the core housing need piece is a huge component of that work, but all to say that there's actually not a required methodology that the province has provided, and we've been in conversation with them, knowing they'll likely update some of the regulations around housing units and housing needs reports, and it's likely they might provide further direction to local governments once they have a better understanding of how they want to direct folks to go about this work. But right now it's a bit of a gray area, actually.
So a follow-up, if I might, then, if sort of, do we have the capacity to take a look at the McPhail report? And I can't remember what numbers they use, but to sort of take this report and say, we should actually increase the numbers by 15% if we want to significantly address housing affordability. Is that something we could do theoretically, just setting aside the challenges of building that many units, or something that we would, or is there a reason why we shouldn't do that?
I guess if I might just continue a little bit, and Matt, if you have other comments, feel free to jump in. One of the things that we've played with as part of this process is the household growth projection rate. So we're using what has been typical in Squamish over the last census period, as well as what's outlined in your OCP under that high growth scenario. So the actual number of units is really tied to that rate. If there was an interest in playing with that and going to an even more kind of aggressive growth scenario, then theoretically the unit number would increase, the estimate would increase. The thing that's a little bit more nuanced that might speak a bit more to the affordability piece is the different income quintiles that we've established. Because of limitations in getting new census data, we're using 2016 information right now. So all of those income brackets are based on Squamish's median income circa 2015 tax filer year. But what's really exciting is that the UBC HEART team has committed to publish all of the 2021 custom data for each census division and census subdivision across Canada. So there will be publicly accessible information that the District of Squamish can access to update the unit, the income quintiles, which would correspond to those estimates based on how much households can afford on a monthly basis. So I think that might help get at the affordability piece somewhat more. In terms of the number of units total, that really comes down to what you folks think is appropriate to estimate based on past trends, based on maybe what you know to be coming forward. And right now we were estimating a 6.3 household growth rate.
And sorry, so just to follow, like what the McPhail report said, as I understand, is, once you've got your population estimate growth, rather than sort of mirroring that with your home growth, you try and build more homes at a higher rate, and that's how you get to the affordability piece. So we would do that through the quintile, or sort of the quintile would help us figure how to accelerate or where to accelerate those numbers.
Yeah, so I wish you were on the housing, but the HEART team had a webinar last week and a lot of these questions came up. One of the things that the McPhail report outlined was suppressed household formation, that folks aren't creating households because of affordability challenges. I think you're getting more at that piece, that there are limitations right now and trade-offs that households are making because there isn't housing available that meets their needs. So that's what the HEART team is hoping to do in the next iteration of the work that they're creating, and what the province is trying to do in this kind of bigger exercise to create a more standardized methodology that can help address housing needs. Right now, there isn't really a methodology that's available that folks have been using that can address some of those pieces like suppressed household formation. I think updated income data would be really helpful to get a clearer sense of where different households fall in the Squamish scenario, looking at an updated median threshold. But I think understanding the pieces where you're baking in current assumptions and applying those forwards, that work is underway right now. And I'm not at a place where I could recommend an alternate methodology, but it's something that is being worked on right now by the province and by the HART team.
Councillor Hamilton?
Thanks very much, Julia, for the elaborate report on the housing needs. My question is actually for the staff. Can you, oh, no, never mind. I was going to say go back to the slide, but no, don't worry about that. Oh, yeah? Okay, the slide on that had our zoning capacity. No.
We'll figure it out.
Okay, it's actually not that important. So that's our zoning capacity. But we certainly have more information than just our zoning capacity, right? We know how many units are in the pipeline at various stages, expected to come out of the pipeline at various stages. Do you have, or can you compile a detailed report on what housing we expect to be coming out of the pipeline in the coming 5 years?
Thank you. Through the chair, that is a question that we've looked at many, many times in the past, and it's a bit of a, it's not very scientific, and it doesn't provide any assurance that those units will be created within a certain amount of time. When projects go through a rezoning process, they can take between 1 year and, as we saw today, the Cheekeye fan rezoning has been in the works for 10 years. So there's just no reliability in those numbers, and the numbers change themselves. The housing mix and the amount of housing evolves. So we can certainly produce something, but it would be conceptual. So wouldn't provide, any assurances that these units are now in the reason why we use zoning as a threshold is because once the zoning is done, it's up to the developer then to come in, apply for a development permit. So it's kind of out of our hands and into their hands. And so there's, our kind of supply dial is really the units that have already been zoned. That's when we've turned on the supply. So that's why we use only strictly lands that have already been zoned and are now in the development process. But we could produce, another estimate of what it is that's in the pipeline, but there's problems with it.
Councillor Anderson?
I have a question regarding maybe methodology for next time a survey is undertaken. I'll just start by citing the present study, which cites the District Housing Strategy of 2018 under Facilitate Workforce Housing states, encourage and work with employers and businesses to coordinate voluntary employer-assisted housing programs. When my family moved to Squamish in the early 60s, Squamish had a severe housing shortage. And one of the main responses, and in all instances with support from the federal government at that time, was for several larger employers to be engaged in building housing and, in fact, whole subdivisions. So the wood fiber pulp mill, together with Britannia Mine, developed Valleycliff, and also housing in the Highlands. They built houses on Braemar. The school district, the Forest Service, the hospital, BC Hydro, and BC Telephone Company all built houses for their employees during that period. My question is this not of interest for a survey? And I wonder whether, perhaps based on your experience, our consultant or staff, whether we might engage directly with employers or survey this, design this element into a future survey. It'd be of interest to build a picture of needs and stakeholders from an employer perspective, and also maybe for our purposes in advocacy, future senior government program initiatives that we might advocate for catering to employers. Now, not all employers want to be involved in housing delivery, but inevitably today they are, from small employers to large. I just wonder whether it might be a neglected topic that might be relevant for next time we do a housing needs survey, addressing and engaging with employers.
Thank you, and Mayor Herford.
Thank you. Just on this table that's still up, I think that including, I think I really appreciate this method for this, and I think including potential from rezoning is really problematic because it presupposes the outcome of that process, which is what our work is around this table, and staff's work is to ensure that happens in a meaningful way. So I'm not particularly interested in seeing that, except for showing what the gap is between what's approved and what our need is and how we can address that, because yeah, I see a lot of challenges there. Is that essentially what you're speaking to? In that I heard unreliable numbers, but I have sort of a process perspective there. Is that the type of thing that you're speaking about?
Through you, Chair. That's exactly it. It's problematic from our side in terms of reliability, but that relates to the fact that the land use has not yet been approved by council. And so there's lots of uncertainty in that outcome.
Okay, thank you. I particularly found in this report, I found the needs per sort of unit type really, really interesting, and is something that will be referring to going forward. And I assume that am I correct to assume that that's the type of way that staff would use this report as we do contemplate future developments?
Yes, through the chair. Yes, I think that table in particular is going to be very informative for consideration of policy across the community and how zoning changes over time, neighborhood planning, large projects. I think it'll provide information on where our shortfalls are in housing types. We typically talk about housing forms, so townhouses, plexes, single family. The report is based on bedroom numbers, which is related to number of people. And so there's a bit of a interpretation between those. And one thing which was in a bit of the fine print, which I do want to highlight, is that the report, which highlights 3 and 4 bedroom units that are needs, they assume 1 person per bedroom. And there is a footnote that says that some of those 4 bedrooms may be 4 people families who in Squamish context may actually wind up in 3 bedroom units. So I think we'll have to take some of that information and figure out how to apply that to the appropriate housing forms. But I think it will be very important information for considering what housing forms we need as we move forward.
Thank you. And then in this, in one of my previous comments, I was talking about not presupposing outcomes, but now we're talking about provincial regulation, so it's not our outcome. We'll just sort of speculate a little bit. But here, those detached, approved detached, sounds like those could be potentially approved duplexes under the new regulations from the province, and maybe those duplexes are more. I suppose this report's done sort of with and appropriately so, with the regulations of the day. And so I guess it goes to sort of shelf life of this as the regulation is set to change fairly quickly and maybe ongoing. So does that change how often we would do one of these? Like the frequency of updating the need, or can the same data be sort of manipulated a little bit given the new regulations, just so that we can continue to be the best tool that it could be for our decisions?
Yeah, I think there's 2 elements to your question that I would respond to. One is about the cycle of updates, and it is provincial discussion that will have to be finalized and approved by the legislation, or by the legislature. But they're going to identify, as our understanding, a cycle of updates to these reports. So our frequency of update and what methodology needs to be included, I think that'll come down from the province, and we'll be compelled to follow that. The other piece that you're talking about is how do we respond to that, and what do we need to do to address the needs? And I think what you're getting to is, as provincial regulations around zoning change, and we will may be compelled at some point, as we heard from David Eby's recent announcement, that we may be compelled to provide more opportunities. That information is could inform this and provide more opportunities. Now, we said that this was greenfield and brownfield sites. The duplex and detached, in particular, if we have large zoning changes in the community, the opportunities for triplex and fourplex, which we've heard the Premier talk about, will be quite vast, because we have many properties that are older stock that could be rebuilt as triplexes or fourplexes. And so there'll be probably a need for us to engage in some consideration of how those numbers will meet the housing needs over time. I think that will be part of the cycle that will be formed or compelled to do by the province. But yeah, there is going to be, you see 20 and 35 on the duplex and detached numbers here. Well, in fact, if we look at all properties that could be redeveloped at higher housing forms like triplexes and fourplexes, given the provincial legislation, those numbers would be much, much larger.
Okay, thank you. And then I was curious around the if the housing society was referred to in the process, or if it's just something that we can provide to them, or what their involvement was with the process, if any.
So we actually, Jonas and I have only recently been engaged in carrying this project forward. I do know there is reference to the Housing Society in the report. So there is, awareness of that society. I don't know that they were engaged as advocates or stakeholders to inform the process, but maybe Julia can speak to that in a second. But I have referred it to the report to one of the representatives of the Development and Acquisition Committee from the Housing Needs Assessment, who I'm in touch with through another project. And so they're aware of it, and I wouldn't be surprised if they start using it as an informative tool.
And I can just add to that and say that we did have representatives from the Squamish Community Housing Society at our roundtable virtual focus group with nonprofits. So I believe we had a board member as well as a staff member in attendance.
Thank you. My next question was, is the Squamish Nation their HIAM housing, and if they were included in that process as well?
So we had an interview with a representative from HIAM Housing as an additional kind of engagement moment, because they were unable to attend the focus group, but did have connection with their housing society, not directly with Squamish Nation, but with a representative from HIAM Housing.
Great. And I guess the last piece of that would be that this report has the final report been shared with both of those entities as well, or is that something that we would endeavor to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. It hasn't been shared with them yet. I think I wanted to wait until things were sort of finalized, but I think that'd be a great next step if you folks are able to share it with them. I think that'd be lovely.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks very much. I actually just want to go back to my previous question. I was surprised to hear Mayor Herford not seeing the value in these more detailed numbers. So when I look at the table that you produced, I see roughly 5,800 units zoned. Yeah. And when I look at the report, I see that we need approximately 6,800 units by 2031. There's a large development that's not on your list that would certainly accommodate that shortfall. And the only conclusion I could draw then is that we have sufficient zoning to accommodate our housing needs. Is that the conclusion I should draw? Or what other data do I need to draw a different conclusion?
I'm not through chair. I can't speak to the conclusion you should draw. But what we're recommending is do not rely on the projects that have not been zoned yet. And this picture might change in a year or two, but for instance, the rezoning, the debris flow management report that we saw this morning, there's still a huge lift to make those units happen, in an order of almost $100 million. So lots of uncertainty still. Once those lands are rezoned, then our supply picture will likely change. But we could still be years away from that point.
One other piece to add to that, I think one important piece, and we did try and include the text, but there's a whole piece around how long will it take for all of this to be delivered. The oceanfront, for example, is a project that has been under works for how long?
For at least 8 years since they've had zoning.
Yeah.
Right. So again, since 2015. That's right.
And so, the housing needs assessment tries to identify the needs in the next 8-year period, essentially. What this was trying to provide some context, but it is very much a snapshot of just zoning, and the likelihood of these all being delivered within that 8-year timeframe are low. There's, some portion of them will be, but not all of them. I suspect that there would need to be a fair bit of work done to try and make estimates over all of the capacity that could be delivered in the timeline of this report, and that's something that we haven't put that's a fairly big project probably to make that type of estimate across the community, across all the different zoning, across all the different uncertainties, and it's something we haven't resourced at this point.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, I just want to dig into a little bit. The report speaks a few times to the need for ground oriented. And I know we also talk about missing middle in some of our other work. But I just want to understand that need versus preference or desire. And I guess, I think it's becoming more clear that single family is very high cost for housing very few people. And so there's a fundamental challenge there. And so then is this more of a preferred thing compared to apartments for some people, and that's why we prefer more of it? Or is there a fundamental need that can only be met with that form? I'm just wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think through the chair, I think on face value, it's really referencing preference. That when we're talking about the missing middle and there's a preference for ground oriented, that's really about what we see consumers or residents wanting to purchase. But there is some really important financial considerations in the equation. And in discussion with home builders, what we do here is that the cost of construction, the per square foot cost of construction for apartment buildings is quite high compared to ground-oriented housing forms. And so if we're looking at trying to provide housing for a family of 4, for example, and maybe they're squeezing into 3, they're not getting the 4 bedrooms as the HART methodology supposes. When you start looking at 3-bedroom apartment units, because of the high cost of construction of that housing form, the cost of that product starts getting quite close to townhouse product, and the differential in cost between a 3-bedroom apartment and a 3-bedroom townhouse is quite small. And so there's a real hesitancy for consumers to purchase that 3-bedroom. This is what we hear from the home builders, that they have quite a bit of hard time selling that product, that it tends to sit, even though a project of 1 and 2 bedrooms may sell very quickly, the 3-bedroom will languish through the development process and hopefully will be sold sometime near the end. But they don't have that high demand because the cost, maybe it's, only $100,000 less than going to a townhouse. And so it seems like that preference piece comes in and people wait looking for that townhouse product and don't make that investment. So I think it is a preference, but I think the economics make it hard to, maybe what you're thinking is, hey, can we just say, hey, we'll do lots of 3-bedroom, but they're going to be 3-bedroom apartments, and hope that that'll fill that gap. And there may be some economic realities that make it less likely to be a successful strategy to address that issue.
I have a couple questions. I hear a lot of conversation around what we should build and how much to, meet the housing demand. But I'm wondering if any of these studies actually focus on the cost of growth on a municipal level. For instance, what kind of upgrades to amenities and infrastructures are required, including things like the per capita cost for infrastructure, including road maintenance and upgrades, increased childcare considerations, increased medical services, and also I'd like to see an age demographic breakdown for how many children, if that's possible from that data set. Because this is all important information for growth, right? It's not just housing, it's life.
If I may, that's a great question. I think we're hopeful that the next step is the province looking at expanding the development cost charge allowance for local government. So right now, all new development, every new unit, unless it's affordable housing or a secondary suite, has to pay in development cost charges, and those go into funding our infrastructure expansion that's required for growth. So that's water, sewer, roads, storm, but it does include like fire halls or rec centers. So that's something that the municipalities have been asking the province to expand into, so that we can appropriately charge for this new growth. Without that, we rely on our CACs essentially to add funding to those community amenities. So in that process, the rezoning is really important. And I think there's, going to be an obvious hesitance from municipalities across the province to pre-zone lands without securing CACs. So I'm hopeful that the province is going to expand what we can do with development without having to go for a rezoning process. But those are the two tools we currently have.
I also noticed that in this report, there's no mention of, and I mean, there kind of can't be, but alternative housing like tiny homes and vehicle residences. But I don't know. That's more of a comment than a question. Oh, that's what I was going to ask. In the report, it states that there's a desire for 3+ bedroom houses, but currently we tend as a council to prefer, not single houses. Is there any suggestion that we should be changing direction, or are we waiting for the people who are overhoused to kind of move out and open that up?
Yeah, so I think maybe if I hear your question, are you saying that the 3-bedroom houses might typically be assumed to be single family homes, and that was that the comment, and that we're not supportive of that?
I believe that there is a comment in the report that stated that there are quite a few 3+ bedroom houses that are currently holding like 1 or 2 inhabitants, kind of thing. So like, are we thinking about changing our stance towards housing towards actually building more single dwellings instead of the kind of smaller footprint houses, or are we feeling okay about our stock and hoping that those open up?
Yeah, okay. I think maybe there's a few things there that I could speak to. One is that when there's a discussion around the 3-bedroom housing being an important piece of the housing continuum, the report articulates, which I think is something that our OCP reflects quite strongly, that there are missing middle housing forms that can provide that, whether they're plexes, they're townhouses. There's a range of ground-oriented products that can meet that need, but you can accommodate more of them in a smaller space and thus reduce your infrastructure costs, harking back to your last question. So there are opportunities to address that need without doing single family, which does have higher infrastructure costs and does provide less opportunity to house more people. The other piece that you spoke to is the overhoused population that the report highlights. And I think what I was seeing in there was an identified need for more housing that provided opportunities for accessibility or aging in place, which would provide, and smaller units that would provide opportunities for those individuals to move out of larger houses that could open up space. So if we provide aging places with accessible or age-in-place characteristics. Some of people who are currently maybe an individual in a larger house and ready to downsize might be more readily able to, opening more opportunities for people who are looking for those 3-bedroom locations. I think that's maybe a few of the dynamics, but maybe Julia, do you have more that, or maybe the consultant Julia would have more that she would want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to sort of reiterate some of Matt's points, I think the ground-oriented 3-bedroom homes, we're specifically saying homes and not houses there. So I think there really was, we heard through engagement, a need for ground-oriented options for families that are more affordable. And I think that refers to the identified need for missing middle housing, plexes, townhouses, duplexes, like that whole kind of range, something that is between a single detached house and an apartment building. So I think that is an important consideration, and I'm glad Matt raised the comments that we heard at the Development Liaison Committee about the challenges of making 3-bedroom apartments financially feasible when projects typically end up penciling close to a townhouse, and that ends up being more desirable. So I think it goes back to that piece around the missing middle kind of component, and the pattern that Squamish is seeing with folks being overhoused is somewhat typical across Canada. That's not necessarily something distinct that's happening in your community, but I think it will be really interesting as population aging continues, what happens to some of those units that are likely inhabited by older residents as they downsize and transition. So monitoring how the housing stock is changing over time. And I should, emphasize that data about household size based on how many bedrooms are in a house, that again is dated. It's 2016 information. So when Hart has more updated information available, it'll be interesting to see how that's shifted as well, if there's already been a change and a shift toward maybe some of those households downsizing. But the need is really so complex. It is the smaller units for folks to downsize into, as well as the larger units that are affordable to families who are making moderate incomes. So it's hard to kind of say there's that one need, but I think the missing middle piece came through loud and clear in our engagement, that people are really looking for options that can meet their needs that are more affordable than a detached house.
Thanks. Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, I just want to come back to this question of the cost of growth, and just to make sure I understand. So, obviously, if you have more people, you require more services and infrastructure. So there's a higher net cost, but you also have more taxpayers, so it's split more ways. So if I understand correctly, in general, if growth increases density, it tends to bring down the cost per taxpayer, especially existing taxpayers. Whereas if your growth decreases density, so large lot, single family, that tends to increase the cost for taxpayers for the same amount of service. Is that sort of how the math generally works?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, I guess there are a couple categories of the cost of growth, and one is in the ground infrastructure. And I think that's one of the pieces that is really relevant to what you're discussing, the pipes, the sewer, the water delivery, the road network. Those we currently can use the DCC bylaw to fund new development when new development occurs, the development builds that infrastructure, and then we can use a DCC bylaw to accrue money to do upgrades that are required for the growth. But as we increase the density, we bring the per dwelling unit cost down for any stretch of pipe. So if we build an apartment, the cost for each of those units for the infrastructure that's serving them does go down. And that is one thing that we've heard from engineering very clearly, that the more the density along given infrastructure, the lower cost per unit.
Mayor Herford?
Thank you. I was curious, this is maybe more of a question for the consultant, but I'm curious if there was anything that wasn't included in the report that jumped out and isn't a requirement from the provincial methodology that sort of stood out for you for our community, as far as any demographic changes or anything that just looks quite different than the rest of the work that you do.
I love this question. It's funny because we typically get asked it in most communities. How are we different? Honestly, I think looking at Squamish's growth rate when we did our first kind of scan of the data, like that just jumps off the page. That's really not something that we're seeing in a lot of the communities that we're working in, a little bit in the interior in some areas, but that number is just so significant. And I think just looking at how much rental housing has come online recently, that there has been a bit of an increase in seeing more diversity, that the trend seems really positive, but you're still seeing rental vacancy rates of less than 1%, really significant price increases in the cost of housing. So I think it's challenging, and there feels like Squamish is at this sort of tipping point moment of really needing to kind of consider what its future looks like when it comes to housing and community development and growth and all of those pieces. I think one of the things that felt a bit distinct was some of the comments just made in that workshop that we attended briefly with the developers, the Development Liaison Committee, in the limited amount of townhouse development that's come online. Like, I think in other communities, we're really starting to see a shift toward more multi-unit development above and beyond apartment buildings exclusively. And it does feel like maybe that's one area where Squamish hasn't really leveled up yet, so to speak, to explore some of the flex type work and more of those kind of in-between housing options. But it seems like the trends are positive, and it's just, I think, a tough place to be when you're kind of getting out of a hole that we across Canada and across BC have been in for a long time. But yeah, nothing that was necessarily not included in the report that I think would be important to mention, but we double checked the growth numbers like 5 times because we couldn't believe it was that high.
Yeah, thank you. And the sort of the current, I'd call it a deficit position that we're in with that vacancy rate and other demands, and that was calculated into this as well. This isn't assuming that what we have today is working or acceptable. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. I think this is another area where the methodology needs to go a step further. Our team is working with Kelowna right now to take the HEART methodology and try and position it to be even stronger. And one of those things is considering, like, what would happen if we took the vacancy rate to 3% and we factored in things around household formation. And we haven't even figured out what that looks like yet. We're working with other subconsultants who have even more kind of economic and market research analysis to better understand that. But I think at a baseline, the HEART methodology does take into account some of these pieces and is cognizant of the not wanting to bake in current trends that there will be limited rental housing, but you can see we haven't provided unit need estimates based on tenure. So that's, I think, a limitation and an important one to kind of reckon with, and hopefully something that the province will be looking at as they roll out this sort of new direction around methodology.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, just a bit curious. So this report and the McPhail report both seem to, in general, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing them, but suggest that we need more homes, and these reports help us figure out what sorts of housing we need and timelines and so on. But obviously at the end of the day, we need to build a lot more. Is there anyone that's sort of saying instead, or maybe in addition, actually what we should be doing is reviewing our OCP and targeting, instead of just going along with the fact that this is an attractive place for younger couples and, high income earners, let's develop services in a community and a community design that targets lower income seniors and sort of address demand through that sort of other community design, as opposed to just focusing on supply. Are there examples of sort of changing your OCP or that sort of thing to address these issues?
I can jump in quickly. I think it's been interesting to see how different councils have prioritized housing and haven't. And I don't know if this will totally answer your question, but we saw in the Lower Mainland, Port Moody take a pretty strong anti-development stance between 2016 and 2021. Their population growth declined somewhat, but housing challenges really continued to intensify. By limiting growth and development, there were still pressures because of suppressed household formation, because people's housing needs aren't being met, and those pressures increased, with vacancy rates becoming more challenging and the price of housing increasing. I don't think that approach was proactive per se in getting in front of your policy and regulatory framework, but I think one of the logical pieces that a housing needs report really sets you up to do is consider what additional actions or strategies you might want to contemplate around housing. So a lot of the time we'll work with different municipalities on this needs assessment, better understand the landscape and the current context. and then kind of think, okay, well, what next? What should you do? What are the levers you want to pull? And what kinds of policy and regulatory decisions could you consider to try and have an impact on some of these things? And that can be closely related to an OCP, or it could be a specific housing action plan or housing strategy, those sorts of documents that are, really action oriented and give you a bit of a roadmap to focus on, while recognizing that housing is something that needs commitments and investment from senior levels of government too. But local governments do have a lot of control and influence over land use, which is a really strong area of action. So I think there's some kind of overlap within that housing strategy action plan world and OCP, but I think the piece around being proactive is probably the point I'm trying to make. But Port Moody came to mind immediately.
Wait, could add? Through the chair, I think I just want to expand on what Julia said, is that there's going to have to be some sort of next step, because one of the results is showing that what we've historically produced in terms of housing is not nearly enough. So something has to change. And I think we're, as one of the next steps, we're going to have to consider what is it that we need to change to deliver housing faster.
Councillor Hamilton.
Julia, I've got two questions for you, actually. So in the report, you referred to something called a workforce housing fund. Well, I can imagine what that might be rather than imagining. Can you tell me what a workforce housing fund is and whether there are any municipalities that are using one?
Yes, so this, I believe, is in your OCP already. This was one of the policies that we had summarized. I think big picture, the classic example that comes to mind is Whistler, which is obviously distinct, being a resort municipality, but having something like the Whistler Housing Authority where they're collecting a particular fee for new development and then funneling that into a kind of bucket that then can be used to support new housing. You see similar sorts of initiatives with things like an affordable housing reserve fund, where you're taking a proportion of money from new development or from other areas and allocating it into a particular box that can then be drawn upon. Richmond has historically done some really good work in that area. I think it's about ways to create specific sort of streams and revenue sources to support the creation of housing that would be attainable to kind of moderate income households. And just generally, that workforce housing theme is one where we're seeing a lot of traction around. There's been a lot of kind of emphasis above and beyond folks who are earning really low incomes or might need supports. That's a really huge area as well, but we're working in the Cowichan Valley right now on a workforce housing strategy to really kind of pinpoint this piece around the challenges that employers are having recruiting and retaining staff. So I think the fund would just be sort of a particular vehicle or option to kind of commit revenue toward that could then exclusively be used toward the construction of new housing for those income profiles.
Thanks. Okay, it was actually the use of the word fund that diverted me off. So a housing authority, absolutely, we've got one going on. It's the fund part that was struck my eye. Okay, my second question, and I feel a bit like a dog with a bone here. Have you seen any reliable or moderately reliable mechanisms for a municipality to take a snapshot of what is currently in their development pipeline and ask the question, is this what's currently in sufficient?
It's a complex question, obviously, as the dialogue today probably illustrates. I think it can be one where there is some hesitancy and uncertainty if something hasn't actually received its zoning approvals. I think the way that I've seen it organized in some contexts, I think particularly in the city of Vancouver, is they might have kind of different columns that say applications that have been submitted, applications that have received development permits, applications that have received building permits. So you can kind of see, well, that one's a little iffy. This one's probably pretty for sure, and that's likely happening, to get sort of a broader sense. It's something that's really helpful to be aware of. But again, even in the Vancouver context, you have things like Sanok and Jericho lands, these huge redevelopment exercises, and factoring in some of those numbers can be challenging just because the timelines are still somewhat uncertain. But I think acknowledging that uncertainty is an important piece of that, and just if you do want to report out on what might come online, be very particular about what has sort of more full certainty and what maybe comes with a bit more of a question mark.
Thanks very much.
I just have one final question. Do we have an estimate of how many dwellings in Squamish that are vacant or uninhabited?
I can, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so through the census, we do get information on, I think the term is households not occupied by usual resident. There is it's a fairly easy stat to pull, and I believe in Squamish it's at the low end provincially. I think it might be around 5 or 4%. I feel like I should be very careful because I tend to have trouble remembering numbers if I haven't looked at it for some time. But I know it's dramatically lower than Whistler, which I think is closer to 50%. And when I looked across the province, it looked like it was at the low end of normal. But maybe Julia has a better sense or more able to answer.
Just pulled it up really quick. I have the benefit of being at my screen right now. So the census provides two numbers: total private dwellings and private dwellings occupied by usual residents. And so there are more private dwellings than private dwellings occupied by usual residents. You actually have to do a bit more digging. It's, I think, usually a custom tab to understand what's going on with those dwelling units that are not occupied or occupied by unusual residents, which basically means temporary or not usually present persons. Students is a classic example. A lot of college towns have a really big distinction between these pieces. But as Matt indicated, it's sort of 93% or 7% of Squamish's housing stock is either not occupied or occupied by a not usual resident. And knowing exactly what that breakdown is isn't immediately evident, but it is something that you could get more information on if you wanted to do so.
Actually, if I could add one thing, I do now recall. I think in the 2016 it was around 4 or 5%, and I think in the most recent it did go up to 7%. And I recall looking into it a bit, and one of the things that came up is when you have a high growth rate with a lot of housing being produced, there's often a bit of a lag with understanding how much what the occupancy is, because you have things that there's some kind of gap between when housing's produced and when the occupant has been able to complete a census for it. So I think that was one of the reasons that we had a bit of an uptick between those time periods. I think historically we've been lower than 7.
Okay, thank you. Council, are there any more questions? Okay, move to receipt, seconded by John French. Who would like to speak?
Yeah, thank you for all the work on this. I found it really insightful, and my mind kept going to how I'm going to use this and how we can all use this information going forward. And there's just a lot there, and I think that myself, like I'm sure many members of the community, was really taken aback that the extremely high rate of growth that we have essentially isn't enough by this by evidence of this report, which is a bit, I'm still working to wrap my head around what that means. But yeah, but thank you for that. And in a lot of ways, it reinforces things that I sort of knew intrinsically, but this better quantifies it. So thank you so much. And I know that I'll be referring to this particular report frequently in the coming years. Thank you.
That's great to hear.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Planning Director Viliniskas says something has to change when you look at the numbers and the projections. And under next implementation steps in the report, it says that need assessment results may eventually require the development of a housing strategy, capital H, capital S. I'd like to suggest that a housing strategy should be considered broadly. It should also consider how we produce housing and the opportunities in this. One of the topics at the recent UBCM housing conference was supply chains, and there is reference to that in the quote from the developers that there's a Squamish premium because we don't have available the tradespeople and the local supply chain for materials and components and systems here. It's all imported, and that adds to costs. So we have opportunity, and it comes up all the time, to develop local supply chains and perhaps better trades training programs here. Squamish Nation is part of both pictures. We have a green building component in our economic development strategy, in our green economy emerging sector strategy, but maybe we're considering this too narrowly, and that we could take a closer look at how we can develop local supply chains. We have people wanting to invest in plants to produce prefab and modular and panelized systems, but they got no land to work on. And so I suggest it's not only a housing strategy we need, but we need a housing strategy that's considered broadly, overlapping with an economic development strategy. They will work together. And there's also other amenities and things that come into that picture of a housing strategy too. So I guess my main point is, let's not consider housing strategy too narrowly, and let's not forget how we actually produce housing physically in our building systems, our codes and supply chains and local tradespeople and opportunities to train local people. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Pettengill?
Yeah, a few things. I really appreciated this report and the corresponding McPhail report and digging into it. And I think the thing that jumps out to me is there's a lot of sort of statistics or points you can pull out which support a particular, I guess, position about direction people would want to go. But you really have to look at all the pieces together, because they really sometimes come together in a way that has an opposite impact. And so if we want to do things in a smart way, in a long-term sustainable way, we really have to think about all these pieces. A couple that jumped out at me, and I heard some in the discussion today, is, you know, with our current zoning, we don't have enough coming online to meet what's projected in this. But with our growth management boundary, we do have the theoretical capacity to, well, meet that. And so, you know, I think that's important for us to keep in mind. And the piece that too surprised me a little bit, but adding missing middle actually increases the availability of existing single family, which is sort of interesting. And you know, the fact that we're in a crisis, and so we focus on immediate affordability, but the importance of adding some of that missing middle and what that does to long-term affordability, and making sure we're making decisions that aren't going to just fix it for today, but actually have a long-term impact. And so just a lot of really critical and interesting stuff to dig through and put together. And so I really appreciate the work that's gone into this. And I just wanted to highlight too, I think what I saw in the McPhail report, which I think is relevant here, is there's recognized challenges with CACs and the obstacles and cost issues that can be associated with them. But at the same time, we don't have alternative funding mechanisms. And so despite their problems, it is something that we may need to continue to use, and maybe we can improve that a little bit. But I don't think we can quite assume that it's a simple solution of just get rid of CACs, because we're dependent on that funding. And so, yeah, just lots of really interesting stuff in this, and appreciate all the work.
Thanks, Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. And I will pile on with the thank yous and the kudos. This is an excellent document. It's jam-packed full of great data, great information. Found myself kind of wishing I had this a year ago or even 2 years ago with some of the decisions that we were making in the previous term. And then I'll finish with, I really am looking forward to directing people to this report as required reading for those who think they know all about housing and housing needs and actually don't, because this report really opened my eyes, which I thought were already open, to what the needs are. And so this is required reading for some, and I will be sharing it with those who I think need to read it.
Any other comments? I also found it a very informative report. I found the entire presentation very informative. I would request in future years, if it would be possible, to break out basically school-aged and preschool-aged children in terms of a planning perspective. That would be helpful for me, but I don't know if that's possible. But otherwise, it was very interesting. And with that, yeah, shall we have a vote? All in favor? Okay. Didn't we? Oh, second. Okay. All in favor. I think it's unanimous. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you. And with that, shall we have a motion to close? A motion by Mayor Herford and seconded by Councillor Hamilton. Thanks. All in favor? Thanks.